Welcome to the complete Cisco CyberOps Associate Prep course. In this course, you will learn about the exam topics for the CyberOps Associate certification. You will learn everything from the basics like security concepts to more advanced topics like how to track security events. If you are new to cybersecurity or you're just someone that wants to learn more so you can pass the exam, then this course is for you. As an added bonus in this course, I will also show you how to install Kali Linux hacking tools for free. This will allow you to utilize some of the tools that a pen tester or hacker would use. This course is your first step to obtaining a role as a cybersecurity analyst, which has a great job market with high employer demand, big salaries, and great promotion prospects. So why wait? Start your cybersecurity journey today and enroll in this course. Thanks for checking us out, and we hope to see you in the next video.
Cybersecurity encompasses the technologies, processes, and practices used to protect computer networks from attacks. So if a company wants to prevent security breaches and hacking, then they are investing in cybersecurity. As a cybersecurity expert, you need to understand what types of threats are out there and how to prevent them from being exploited on computer endpoints. The cybersecurity market size is expected to grow from $137 billion in 2017 to $231 billion by 2022 and is a very promising career path. The objective of this course is to teach you the cybersecurity knowledge that you'll need to know for both of the CCNA CyberOps exams. In the next video, we're going to start off with learning how to install Kali Linux, which is a operating system that has a large suite of hacking tools that can give you a better understanding of how networks can be compromised. I'll see you in the next video. Even though you don't need to know how to implement cyber attacks for the CyberOps exam, it really helps to see how attacks are executed to help you understand how things work. And the best way to play around with hacking is Kali. Kali runs on a Linux operating system and has a large collection of hacking tools. In addition to playing around with hacking tools, you will also be able to learn how to use the Linux operating system, which is a great skill to have for any IT field. So before I teach you about cybersecurity, I want to give you a chance to install Kali, and then you can follow along with some of the later examples throughout this course. To install Kali, you could actually just install it right on a laptop or desktop computer, but typically you're going to want to run it in the background and not make it your primary operating system. So for myself, I have a Windows laptop, and I run a VM software that runs Kali in the background as a secondary operating system. I happen to use VMware Workstation for my VMware software, but it is licensed and not free. If you want a free VM software application, you can run things like VirtualBox or ESXi. I'm going to show you how to install the VMware software VirtualBox since it's free, and then once we install VirtualBox, we'll download the free Kali ISO file, install it, and get you up and running with Kali Linux so that you're ready to start playing around with hacking tools. So let's get started by first going to the VirtualBox website. So you'll go to virtualbox.org, and when you get to the home page, you'll see a download VirtualBox button. Click on that, and then it'll take you to the VirtualBox download page, and you'll see that you have options to choose a Windows host, Mac OS X host, or Linux host download. For myself, I'm using a Windows computer, so I'm going to download the Windows host file. And then you're going to run the executable that you're downloading from the website, and then just hit next and install throughout the installation prompts. Once you have the VirtualBox application running on your computer, you're ready to install a virtual machine. For Kali Linux, first we have to go to the Kali download website and download the ISO file that we're going to later import into VirtualBox or whatever virtual machine application you're using, and then install it as a virtual machine. So let's go to the Kali website, which is kali.org, and then go to downloads, and you'll see that you have different download options to choose from. I'm going to choose the Kali 64-bit ISO file to download into my VirtualBox environment. I'll just save that into my downloads, and then once the file finishes downloading to my computer, I will open it into my virtual machine application and go through the installation process. Okay, now that my Kali Linux download has completed, I'm ready to import it into my virtual machine application. So I'll open up my VirtualBox software here, and I'm going to go to Machine and New. I'll call this VM Kali. The type of operating system is going to be Linux, and then I'm fine with Ubuntu 64-bit. Hit Next. And then depending on how much RAM you have on your computer, you want to be careful with how much RAM you allocate to this virtual machine. But you're probably okay with the default value of a little bit over 1 gig of memory. Hit Next. We'll leave the default setting of create a virtual hard disk now. And then I'll also use the default value of what disk file type. Set it for the default of dynamically allocated hard disk. And then file location and size. So be extra careful here. If you don't have much disk space on your computer, then I recommend finding an external storage device. For myself, I have an SD card that I have installed on my computer that I use for storing all of my VM information. So this wants 10 gig. I'll go and I'll choose my SD card location. Put it there, and then I don't have any concerns about using all of my computer's disk space. Now we have to map the ISO we downloaded for the Kali operating system. So we'll go to Settings, Storage, click on this empty option here under our storage tree, and then if you click this disk option, you can find your way to your ISO download. Click my ISO download, and now by choosing that, it's telling this virtual machine to boot from that ISO file. And then I'll hit OK. So now once I start this virtual machine, it should boot up into the Kali operating system. Just so you know, if you're wondering how this virtual machine is going to communicate with the network, by default, it actually uses network address translation and is translated out of our wired or wireless adapters. Okay, so my VM's built. I'm going to click the Start button. And now I have this console window here to access my virtual machine. So I'm just going to hit Enter for this Live AMD 64 option. And then it might take a little bit, but it will eventually load the Kali operating system. You'll notice on the left side of your Kali desktop, you'll have a list of some of the different applications that you can launch, like Metasploit. And if you actually go all the way down to Show Applications here, you'll find a large collection of the different hacking tools that Kali has to offer. Throughout this course, we will demo some of these hacking tools, just to give you a quick glimpse into what you'll find in here. We'll click on the exploit application folder, and one of my favorite applications in Kali is the social engineering toolkit. Click on that, and it's going to take us to a terminal with some of the different categories that we can choose from for different attack types. I'll choose one for social engineering attacks. And as you can see, we have a variety of social engineering attacks that we can execute. So take some time to play around in here. I'll have some links in the lecture resources to documentation on how to run some of the different attacks. And let's try to be nice guys out there, okay? Don't use this to hack into your neighbor's network or your friends or family. Kali should really be looked at as a tool to help you better understand what kind of threats there are out there so that you can be a better cybersecurity engineer. One last thing I want to point out before I end this Kali demo. If you have to log back into Kali, like if your session time's out, there is a default username and password. The default username is root, and the default Kali password is the reverse of root and is TOOR. Before you start to learn about hacking and all of the fun stuff with cybersecurity, first you need to have a good understanding about the network protocols and addresses that are used in networking. So what is a network? Networks are a collection of nodes that communicate with each other. A network can be smaller in size, like your home network, or large, like the internet. Network models are used to standardize how network devices communicate with each other. Each network model layer plays a different role to help data forward out of endpoint network interface cards onto the network. There are two types of network models, TCP/IP and OSI. Both models have the same objective, but they have some differences, including the types of layers that are used. As you can see, each layer has different sets of protocols. Protocols can be thought of as different languages that are used between network devices at each layer. Now let's take a look at each of these layers to help you understand the traffic flow for a network device. At the application layer, data like web applications and email are created. Application layer protocols like HTTP are used to send communication between endpoint applications. In this example, you can see that the HTTP protocol was used to ask the web server for the website's homepage. Once the data has been created, it is passed through each model layer to prepare the data to be transferred onto the network. TCP and UDP are transport protocols that are used for host-to-host communication. These protocols use port numbers for sockets to control which applications receive data on endpoints. Once TCP or UDP is used to establish a connection between hosts, then the higher layer data, like HTTP, can be sent end-to-end. TCP is considered to be a reliable protocol to handle host connections, since it uses acknowledgments and requires a three-way handshake to establish a connection. UDP is an unreliable transport protocol, since it does not track the state of a connection. Here's a list of well-known TCP and UDP ports. As a cybersecurity engineer, you should know what ports applications use so that you can secure vulnerable applications. In fact, most firewall filtering is based on TCP and UDP port numbers. At the network layer, IP addresses are used. These layer 3 addresses are used to route IP packets from one network to another between routers. They serve the same purpose as phone numbers. When someone wants to call you, they type in the phone number that is assigned to your phone, and the phone call is routed all the way through the phone network to you and your phone rings. Just like a phone call, when a computer wants to talk to a network device like a printer, it points to the IP address to connect. Every network device needs an IP address, just like every phone needs a phone number. IP addresses can be public or private, depending on if they are on an internal network, like a home or business, or the internet. Once IP addressing information is added to a packet, it is then wrapped into an Ethernet frame. The Ethernet frame is responsible for error checking and forwarding data after it has been routed onto a LAN. Frames rely on Ethernet addresses called MAC addresses to deliver frame data. MAC addresses are globally unique addresses that are assigned to network interface cards. Once data has traveled through each layer, we end up with an encapsulated frame that contains all of the higher level information. Once the frame is ready, it is sent down to the physical layer. The physical layer is responsible for sending our data ones and zeros as signals out of the network interface card. NICs can connect via wired or wireless. Okay, so now what we're going to do is fire up my computer and go to a website, and then I'll open up a packet capture software so that I can show you what each layer looks like in a real-world connection on a network. So I'm going to open up my Wireshark software here. Wireshark is a free packet capture software, and it will actually show you raw data for what's happening at each of your network model layers. If you check the resources for this video lecture, you will see that I posted a link to the Wireshark website so that you can download the Wireshark software if you don't already have it. Okay, so the first thing you have to do in Wireshark to capture data is choose which network interface card you want to capture data on. So my layer 1 network interface that I'm going to use is my wireless connection. Besides the fact I know I'm connected on wireless, I can see that primarily my network data is traversing this network interface card. So I'm going to double left click on that, and now I have a packet capture opened up and it's capturing all of my traffic. So I'm going to launch a web browser here. Just by going to bing.com, I have created network data on my computer. So since I know that my connection to bing.com was a HTTP connection, I'm going to filter within Wireshark, which does have some like pre-built filters if you hit this filter option, and it will only show you packets that match that filter. So I'm going to filter to HTTP, and it looks like here's my connection to bing.com. So I've clicked on this traffic flow. So this shows that for my IP address of my wireless network interface card of 10.0.11.11, it went to this destination IP address. So this is back to the analogy about making a phone call. I have my network address as my source, and I'm sending my web request to this web server's IP address. So that's how I'm getting from point A to point B from my house all the way out across the internet all the way to the web server at bing.com. So now that I have that packet selected, if you look down below here, you can actually drill down into each network model layer. So we already know for layer 1, I'm using my wireless network interface card. Well, let's jump to layer 2. So at layer 2, it shows that here's my source and destination MAC address. So we have our layer 2 frame that was built here with my network interfaces MAC address and then my gateway's MAC address. And then down to layer 3, we have our IP address information to route across the network. And then here we have our layer 4 information, which HTTP uses TCP as a transport protocol and uses the well-known TCP port 80. So my computer picked a random source port, and then since I knew I wanted to talk to the HTTP application on the Bing web server, I set my destination TCP port to port 80. And here you see some of the application data that I requested when I sent traffic from my computer to that server. In addition to Wireshark, if you're on a Windows, Mac, or Linux computer, there are certain commands that you can run to verify your network information on your computer. I am on a Windows computer, and I can run ipconfig, and that command is going to show me my IP address for my wireless network interface card. And if I do ipconfig/all, I could actually find out more information, like my MAC address for my wireless network interface card up here somewhere, right here. So this shows me my layer 1, layer 2, and layer 3 information for my computer. Okay, so now that you should have a pretty good understanding of the networking fundamentals, in the next video we're going to take a look at some of the networking protocols that can be used in network attacks. Some network protocols can be used as a way to attack networks, and you should understand how they work to enhance your cybersecurity abilities. ICMP is one of the most well-known protocols and is widely used for network monitoring and discovery. ICMP requests, also known as pings, can be sent to a network host or range of IP addresses to verify connectivity. Hackers can maliciously use the ICMP protocol for reconnaissance and denial of service attacks, known as ICMP floods. So even though the ICMP protocol is very useful for troubleshooting and monitoring, to prevent this protocol from helping attackers, it should be blocked on Internet Edge devices. Pings can be sent from any network device. By using the command ping and then your destination IP address or host name, you can verify network connectivity. So here, for my computer, I'm pinging my default gateway router's IP address, and here I can see that my ping was successful and I received ICMP replies from the destination host. If you were to ping something that was unreachable on your network, you would get a request timeout. As you can see here, this destination IP address I'm sending a ICMP request to is not reachable on the network, so I'm getting a request timed out. So you can see a packet capture of an ICMP request in response. I have Wireshark running filtered to only capture ICMP messages, and I'm going to just ping something on the internet. And you can see it's pretty simple. My source IP address is sending a ping request to my destination IP, and then they're responding with a ping reply, which is what we're seeing here in our command line output. In the next video, we're going to talk about ARP, which maps layer 2 to layer 3 addresses for IP version 4 addresses. Well, it doesn't feel right to end the ICMP video without talking about ICMP version 6, which is used for layer 2 to layer 3 mappings for IP version 6 addressing. So just like you'll learn in the next video, when hosts need to communicate to other hosts on the network or routers, they need layer 2 and layer 3 information. By default, if a host wants to communicate with a network device, it knows what the destination layer 3 address is going to be. The hard part is how to figure out what the layer 2 address is for its destination. Earlier in this course, we talked about MAC addresses, which are the layer 2 addresses on networking devices. With IP version 6, this is referenced as being the link layer address. And hosts need to discover their neighbors' link layer addresses so they can communicate with them. And that's what brings me back to ICMP version 6. ICMP version 6 messages can be sent between hosts to help discover link layer addressing, among other things. You're really not expected to know anything about IP version 6 for the exam, but you should at least know about ICMP version 6 and how it can be used to discover link layer addresses. Okay, in the next video, you'll learn how IPv4 hosts learn the same type of layer 2 to layer 3 mapping, but instead using the ARP network protocol. ARP Address Resolution Protocol is a very important concept to understand since it can be used as an attack vector. When an endpoint needs to send data on a network, it needs to have both IP address and MAC address information for its destination. The destination IP address is always known for building IP packets, but destination MAC addresses are not known by default. To encapsulate an IP packet in an Ethernet frame, we must have MAC address information. To find out what the MAC address is of a destination, ARP is used. Endpoints send broadcast frames onto the LAN with ARP request information. These broadcasts are seen by all hosts on the same LAN as the source host. The ARP request asks for hosts with the requested IP address to respond with their MAC address. So if the computer in this diagram wanted to send data to the router, it would first send out an ARP request saying, hey, whoever receives this broadcast and has IP address 10.1.10.1, then reply to my ARP request with your MAC address. So once the router gets this broadcast address, it would then respond with an ARP reply with its MAC address information to populate the ARP table entry for the computer. So you can see ARP in action. I'm going to run Wireshark in the background with it filtered to only capture ARP requests, and then I'm going to try to ping a IP address on my LAN that I know I don't have an ARP entry for. So you'll see as soon as I hit this ping, the first thing my computer is going to do is send out an ARP request for its MAC address. So you can see that as soon as I hit ping, we saw the ARP request go out asking for whoever has IP address 10.0.11.22 tell my IP address 10.0.11.11 what your address is. And here's what the actual ARP data looks like for the ARP request. It has my source MAC address, my source IP address, target IP address, and of course the target MAC address isn't filled out because that's what we're trying to figure out. In the ARP reply here, we see that our destination host responded and said IP address 10.0.11.22 is at this MAC address. So here's the ARP reply with the MAC address that we were looking for so we could finish building our Ethernet frame. DHCP, the Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol, is used to dynamically assign IP addresses to network endpoints. This makes connecting to a network a lot easier for endpoints. Since all network devices require IP addresses to communicate on a network, IP addresses are mandatory. IP addresses can be either statically or dynamically assigned. Imagine the administration nightmare of trying to manually assign IP addresses to hundreds or even thousands of devices. Now we'll take a look at a real-world example of a network computer obtaining an IP address via the DHCP protocol. So here on my computer, I'm going to open up my network connections. I'll go to Change Adapter Settings, find my wireless connection. So here's the wireless NIC that my computer is currently using. And if I go to Properties and click on Internet Protocol version 4 and Properties again, I have the ability to either manually configure my IP address or check Obtain an IP address automatically, which would make my computer use the DHCP protocol. So I'm already configured for DHCP. To refresh my DHCP messages, I'm going to pull up my DOS prompt here. And before I clear my IP address, I'll just run ipconfig. And I want to show you that actually ipconfig/all. And if I look at my network interface configuration, I see that I have DHCP enabled, and here is the DHCP server that sent me the IP address that I dynamically obtained. As you can see in the background, I have Wireshark running, and it's filtering only to capture DHCP messages. So let's release my DHCP address by using the command ipconfig/release. So I just sent a release message to my DHCP server saying, hey, I don't want this dynamically configured IP address anymore. And then I'll say renew, which will trigger a request for a new DHCP IP address. And I should have reobtained an IP address dynamically, which I did. Here in the packet capture, you can see that when I set my release command, my IP address told my DHCP server that I do not want this address anymore. I'm basically releasing this IP address, and it can be used for other clients. And then when I said renew, I went through the DHCP client discovery process all over again. So you can see I sent a broadcast address with my DHCP discover message that reached my gateway, which forwarded it to my DHCP server. Then I see the offer response, followed by a client to server request message. And then finally, I received an acknowledgement with the IP address that was going to be assigned to my computer. Cybersecurity attacks on DNS servers are one of the most significant threats to internet security today, and it is important to understand how it works. DNS, domain name server, is used to resolve names to IP addresses. When you type google.com in your web browser, behind the scenes your computer is doing a DNS lookup to find the IP address of the website that you're trying to connect to. You can almost compare it to saving a phone number as a contact in your phone. So when you want to call someone on your cell phone, instead of actually typing in their actual phone number every time, you just pull up your contact name and then hit call, and it resolves the contact name to the phone number that you have stored in your phone contacts. And in the background, you're actually calling that phone number and not the contact name. Just like with networking, even though in our web browser we're typing in google.com, we're actually in the background connecting to google.com's IP address. So why not go just directly to the IP address, you may ask yourself? Well, for users, it is a lot easier to remember a name like google.com instead of the actual IP address. DNS is built around a hierarchy of servers. At the top level is the root servers that own anything. Once a root server receives a request, it sends a response back to direct the requester to the right server based on what top level domain you need to reach, like .com or .org. Then the top level domain server will direct the requester to the owner of the domain name, like Google for example. Here's what a DNS request for google.com would look like within the hierarchy of domain name servers. So you can see an example of a DNS request. In my terminal here, I'm going to ping bing.com. And in the background, I have Wireshark running, and it's filtering to only capture packets that match DNS server requests. So when I ping this, my computer should send a DNS lookup request to my DNS server. Okay, so you can see that my computer sent a DNS request to my DNS server at 10.0.3.3, and then my DNS server responded with the IP address for the domain name that I requested. So far in this course, we have learned about how network endpoints create data and utilize different network protocols. But how does endpoint data get from one host to another? This is where network devices come into play. There are many network devices in our networks, and each of them play a specific role to forward traffic between endpoints. Here are some of the most common network devices that are on almost every network. Let's take a brief look at each of these network devices. The first network device we're going to talk about are hubs. Hubs are legacy layer 1 devices that were used to just simply interconnect devices so that they could communicate with each other. So like in the slide, if I wanted these two computers and this printer to be able to talk, I could plug them into a hub and they would be able to reach each other. Well, the problem with hubs is that unlike modern day switches, they didn't have any intelligence on how to forward frames. Hubs work by simply forwarding any received frames out of all interfaces, which is a terrible design because regardless of which endpoint the frame was destined to, every host on the network receives a copy of the frame. This can obviously degrade performance on a network. Well, to solve this problem, switches were introduced. Switches forward layer 2 Ethernet frames between switch ports based on MAC addresses. Once a switch learns a MAC address, it can determine which switch port to forward the frame out of based on its MAC address table entry, also known as the CAM table. So in this example, based on these MAC address table entries that the switch has, it would know to forward layer 2 frames destined to the phone out of port G108. One very important switching concept is a broadcast domain. A broadcast domain is a boundary for layer 2 traffic. When a broadcast frame is forwarded onto a LAN, it can only be sent within its local broadcast domain. Broadcast domains can improve network performance and security by limiting traffic between hosts. To create multiple broadcast domains on a switch, VLANs are used. VLANs are a logical division of layer 2 traffic within a switched network. They are frequently used to secure traffic at a layer 2 level. For example, if I had servers and guest devices coexisting on my corporate network, I would not want the potentially vulnerable guest devices to be able to talk to my secure servers. So by simply placing these different traffic types on separate VLANs, you could begin to enforce traffic borders to help secure the network. A VLAN best practice is to actually assign different VLANs to each device type. Next, we have routers. Routers are used to route IP packets between different networks. The entire internet is actually made up of thousands of routers used to send IP packets between houses and websites like Google and Facebook. Even though routers are primarily used to route IP packets, they can also be used to secure networks with features like IP filtering and IPS. Finally, we have wireless devices. Wireless connectivity is a major concern when it comes to securing a network and should be protected with strong encryption and authentication methods. Wireless access point deployments can be autonomous or lightweight. Autonomous APs are configured and managed individually and do not scale well. Lightweight APs are centrally controlled by a wireless LAN controller. For security alone, this is a big advantage for monitoring and maintaining consistent secure configurations across the wireless network. Now that you know what networks are and how they work, you're ready to learn how to protect them. In the next section, we will talk about network security devices like firewalls and IPSs. Network security systems, like the ones shown here, each play a specific role to try and prevent networks from being compromised. The main focus of these devices is to stop malicious traffic before it has a chance to reach an endpoint on the network. In this section, we're going to take a brief look at each of these security systems. Firewalls are the core of network security. They are placed on the network to create borders between trusted and untrusted networks called zones. Firewalls are responsible for blocking most of the unwanted malicious traffic trying to enter the network. Stateful firewall inspection keeps track of the state of connections and helps firewalls keep a close eye on what is traversing its zones. State tables are used to track the current state of each connection. This allows the firewall to permit or deny traffic based on if a connection is established and from where traffic originates from. A connection is considered to be established after the SYN, SYN-ACK, and ACK exchange is completed during a TCP three-way handshake. If a connection is sourced from a trusted zone to an untrusted zone, the return traffic is permitted since the connection is in the state table and was initiated from a trusted zone. However, if traffic is sourced from an untrusted zone like the outside, and there is not an access list rule to permit the traffic inbound, then the traffic will be denied. One of the most basic yet powerful network security features is access lists. Access lists can be applied on network devices to filter IP traffic based on source and destination IPs or layer 4 port numbers. A good use case for access lists is for public-facing devices that are behind firewalls. If you have a web server that is accessible via the internet, then you probably only want internet users to be able to communicate with the server on TCP port 443 for HTTPS access. And you would not want them to be able to communicate with other protocols like remote desktop. The biggest security no-no for firewalls is to allow any IP access to public-facing devices. If an attacker can access all of the open ports on a host, then it makes it a lot easier to find vulnerabilities to exploit. And that's why access lists are critical to block access before traffic can be processed at the application layer. Intrusion prevention systems provide an additional layer of security to catch traffic that firewall features cannot. IPS devices can inspect data and check if anything in the payload matches an IPS signature. IPS signatures are sets of rules that look for malicious traffic patterns. If traffic matches an IPS signature, it can be dropped and an alert can be sent to a monitoring system. Now we'll hop into Cisco's Firepower Management Center that I have running in the lab so that you can see what the IPS signature list looks like to give you a better idea of what type of traffic IPS signatures are identifying. So here we are on the GUI page for the Firepower Management Center. The Cisco Firepower Management Center is a central management point for any firepower security device. So if I had multiple security devices running on my network, I could actually push IPS policies to all of my devices right from this central management GUI, as well as look at reports and data that's been collected from my devices. So here under the Summary Dashboard Intrusion Event page, you can see there's widgets that show the top attackers for intrusion events, as well as what applications were used for the different IPS signature hits. If I want to look at specific intrusion events, I can go to the Analysis Intrusions Events page. It gives us a nice syslog looking list of intrusion events that have been captured by our security devices. So here are a few IPS signatures that have been matched from traffic traversing my security devices. I'm going to go ahead and right click one of these events and I can actually go to rule documentation. So this is going to give me detailed information about this signature so I can determine if this is a false positive or if this should have actually been blocked. So here this tells us that this event is generated when the HTTP inspect preprocessor detects a request for a URL that is longer than a specified length. This may indicate an attack or an attempt to evade an IDS. And then it goes into more detail if you want to really get into it. Now I'm going to go to policies and intrusion just to show you what type of signatures can be enabled or disabled. So this is where I would configure all of the IPS signatures for my security devices. There's categories you can go through. Let's check out exploit kit. Okay, so I have signature IDs, a message giving a brief description of what the signature is matching. And here's a column to configure the rule to be disabled, dropped, or generate events. Once we're happy with which IPS rules are enabled or disabled, then we would add this IPS policy to our access control policy and then deploy it out to our security devices so that they could inspect traffic based on these IPS signatures. Next generation solutions like Firepower also include an anti-malware feature. Cisco's AMP solution is another layer on top of IPS scanning. AMP scans files and checks to see if they are considered to be malicious by the Cisco Security Cloud. If the AMP cloud says the file is clean, then the file is sent to the destination host. But if the AMP cloud determines that the file is malicious, then it can be dropped. Now let's take a tour of Firepower AMP so that you can have a better idea of what type of configuration can be applied for preventing malware. So here I'm back in the Firepower Management Center GUI. First I'm going to show you the configuration options for AMP. So if I go to Policies, Access Control, Malware, and File, that will take me to the Network AMP configuration area. While that's loading, I want to point out that there's two different types of AMP with Firepower. There's Network AMP and AMP for endpoints, also known as FireAMP. Network AMP is when you have a hardware or virtual device that's actually scanning files as they go in and out of your network, while AMP for endpoints or FireAMP is a endpoint solution and actually runs on your computer or mobile device and scans files locally. So here on my FMC, I have a file policy that is being applied to my security devices. And just like an access list, you're creating rules. So I have one rule that defines what types of files I'm going to scan and then the action I'm going to take based on if the file is malicious. So let's go to edit this so you can see what type of options you have. Here are the different file type categories that you can select. And if you want, you can actually select specific file types. Since this is a lab environment, I just have all the categories selected. And then there's also some additional scanning that you can have applied to your security system with dynamic analysis or Spiro. And then I'm saying, what's my action? So I can say just detect files to just get log information for file transfers. I could block specific file types regardless if they were malware or not. So maybe my company has a policy that says no executables are allowed to be transferred externally. I could match on executables and just say block files. And then we have malware cloud lookup and block malware. Malware cloud lookup would be if I wanted to just monitor if I had malware traversing my network, and this would check the AMP cloud to see if files were malicious or not, and it would just give me a log event so that I could be aware that there was malware on my system. Or your best bet, which is what I'm doing in my policy, is to block malware. So this means when a file traverses my Firepower device, when it checks the cloud to see if the file is malicious or not, if the cloud comes back and says it's malware, then I'm going to block the file transfer. If we want to monitor our malware events, we can go to Analysis, Files, and Malware Events. And here is a list of the malware events that have been triggered in my network environment. One really cool thing about AMP with firepower is something called the file trajectory. So if I go to network file trajectory, it's going to show us how a file entered the network and then what hosts it was transferred between, and if it was allowed or blocked. You can either select recently viewed files from your file trajectory or paste in a file hash, IP address, or file name. I'm going to paste in a file name that I know was triggered as malware. And here's the file trajectory for that malware. So here you can see how and when the malware entered the network, as well as if it was transferred and blocked. Email security needs to be one of the highest network security priorities. Email is becoming more vulnerable every day. We are at constant risk of receiving spam, malicious software, and data loss from email. To mitigate email threats, a Cisco email security appliance can be implemented with features like anti-spam, antivirus, malware protection, and data loss prevention. Cisco email security can also be deployed as a cloud-based solution in place of an on-site appliance. Web-based threats are also a high priority when it comes to network security. Malware can be accidentally downloaded from bad websites and could compromise endpoints. To mitigate web-based threats, a Cisco web security appliance can be implemented with features like URL filtering, application visibility, malware protection, and data loss prevention. Just like email security, Cisco Web Security can also be deployed as a cloud-based solution in place of an on-site appliance. There are multiple ways that network traffic can be monitored or blocked by security sensors. The most effective way is inline. With this technique, traffic flows directly through security devices, allowing it to inspect and block malicious traffic. The only downside to inline mode is that data throughput is impacted significantly since each packet is inspected before being forwarded. A less aggressive way to gain network visibility is tap mode. In tap mode, only copies of traffic are redirected to security devices, so malicious traffic can be monitored, but not blocked. To redirect traffic to a tap port, port mirroring is used with SPAN. SPAN switch port analyzer can be configured on switches to instruct the switch to send copies of traffic from certain source VLANs or interfaces to a SPAN destination port connected to a tap. A fairly new way of gaining visibility for security appliances is with NetFlow. NetFlow is a network protocol developed by Cisco for collecting IP traffic information and monitoring network traffic. Traffic learned by NetFlow can be sent to remote monitoring devices for collection with UDP packets. By analyzing flow data, a picture of network traffic flow and volume can be built. With this kind of rich data, security monitoring systems can get a full spectrum of network and security issues. In this section, we are going to cover some security concepts that you should be familiar with for the CCNA CyberOps exam. Defense in depth is the concept of having multiple layers of security protection. For example, if your network firewall is misconfigured or fails, then an endpoint's local firewall could be used as a backup defense method. To identify how and where to implement this strategy, you can use what's called an onion diagram. An onion diagram helps to organize the different layers of a network, identify risks, and decide where to implement security policies. A vulnerability is a weakness in a network system. Some of the most common vulnerabilities that we face in the cybersecurity world are software vulnerabilities. If you go to Cisco's Security Advisories and Alerts webpage, you can see a list of recent vulnerabilities. For example, let's look at this Microsoft Edge vulnerability. The summary documentation says that this vulnerability in Microsoft Edge could allow an unauthenticated remote attacker to access sensitive information on a targeted system. So obviously, this would be a major concern, and this is why it is critical to make sure that our network devices have up-to-date software to eliminate as many vulnerabilities as we can. To find vulnerabilities on endpoints, you can use vulnerability scanning software. To demonstrate what a vulnerability scan looks like, I will use a tool included with Kali called Galishmiro. I think that is how you say it anyways, but I'm not positive. So I'll log back into my Kali virtual machine. If you're logging back into it for the first time and you don't remember the default password, it's TOOR. If you go up to this Applications drop-down from your Kali desktop, it gives you a list of the different categories of applications that you can run. So since I want to show you how to check for vulnerabilities, I'm going to go in to this vulnerability analysis option, and then I'm going to run this top one here with the spider icon. So I'll left click on that. It's going to pull up a terminal, and then it gives you some basic information for how to run this application, as well as what commands you could run. There's Python scripts you can use to run this application. Okay, so now I'm going to show you the string that I use for using this application for scans. I start out with sudo to run this string as a super user to make sure that there's no limitations for any type of permissions that it's trying to use for the scan. And then to actually call out the application, we'll type in Galishmiro. And then I'm going to say the command I want to run for the application is scan, and then my target host. This could be an IP address or a host name. I use the path to my web server, HTTP, and then the name of my web server. And I could just hit enter now and it would scan that target and you would see the output in the terminal. Well, it uses so many plugins by default that could take a really long time, and since this is for demonstration purposes, I'm going to disable some of the plugins that it uses with the -D option and then the name of the plugin. So that's saying disable any plugins with DNS in the plugin name. And then I'll disable anything with brute in it because there's some brute force plugins. Nmap. And then harvester. And finally, I want to output the results to a HTML file. So I'll say -O to output the results, the name of the file. I want it to be called scanresults.html. Okay, so the scan completed. You can see the results of each of the scans right in the terminal. Like, for example, it did show it found a SSL vulnerability. But what's really cool about this application is it'll actually give you a web page summary of the scan. So I'm going to minimize this. Then I'm going to just search for the name of the file that I wanted to output the results to. I'll go to other locations click on computer, and then I'll search for the name of the file that I sent the results to. Now I've found my HTML page. I'm going to double left click it, and then it's going to open up this web page in a web browser. So here's our nice little vulnerability report that the GoListMiro, or whatever it's called, application created for us. It shows my target host and then which vulnerabilities were discovered. We have vulnerabilities by criticality, vulnerabilities by type. So here it did find an invalid SSL certificate vulnerability. And then down at the bottom, it gives you a detailed report, shows the plugin that discovered the vulnerability, as well as a nice description of the vulnerability. An exploit is a targeted attack on a specific vulnerability. Exploit kit tools like Angler or MPAC can be used to easily exploit system vulnerabilities to try and compromise a host. Exploits can be classified as either local or remote. A remote exploit is when an exploit is performed remotely over the network without already having access to a vulnerable system, and a local exploit would require prior local access to the vulnerable system. To discover what vulnerabilities can be exploited on a system, you can use exploit software like Metasploit. Metasploit is one of the most well-known exploit testing programs, and it is included with Kali. Let's jump back in the Kali lab, and I will demonstrate how to use Metasploit. Right from the Kali desktop on the left-hand side, there are some application icons, and the Metasploit framework application can be launched right from there. Or you can go up to the applications drop-down, go down to exploit tools, and then launch it from there. Once Metasploit's done launching, we could run all of our exploits right from the terminal by using Metasploit terminal commands. But what we're going to do is use another application called Armitage, which is a GUI front-end interface for Metasploit. So instead of terminal commands, you have a nice user-friendly interface that makes it a lot easier to run exploits. Now that Metasploit is loaded, I'm going to minimize this, go back to Applications and Exploit Tools, and then launch the Armitage application. When this window pops up, we're going to want to hit Connect, and then yes to start the RPC server. And then this box will run for a few seconds and finally launch the application. Okay, so here's the Armitage application. It actually shows you in a console the terminal version of the commands and output that will be launched when we run the GUI commands. In this rectangular area here is where our hosts will be once we discover them. To pull in host information for the hosts that we want to scan for exploits, you can click on hosts. You could manually just add a host, import hosts. I like to run a Nmap scan. Nmap is a network mapping tool that is used to discover networks and for security auditing. It will run and check what ports are open on devices as well as operating system information. So I'll just run a quick scan with OS detection so we get some operating system information. And then I'm going to put in the IP address of the server that I want to scan. You could also put a whole network in, but that will take a little bit longer. Hit OK. And then you'll see the command that it actually is running in the background in the terminal for this scan. And this may take a little while to run through the scan. Okay, so my scan is complete. Hit OK. And then we can look through the terminal here to see what Nmap discovered for this host. If you hover over the host, it shows what operating system it found. This actually isn't accurate because it's a Windows 2008 server. It's showing it as XP. I could run additional scans to try to get more accurate information for the operating system, but this is okay for this demonstration. If you right click on the host, you can left click services to see what services are running on the host. Next, I'll go to attacks and hit find attacks. So this will populate some possible exploits that we could run on this host. Alright, so the attack analysis has completed. Hit OK. And now when I right click on my host, there's an attack option with different categories of attacks that I can try to exploit on my machine. What's really cool is some of them have check exploits, so it'll actually do a quick check to see if the host is vulnerable for any of these exploits. I'll run this check for IIS exploits, and then you can see down below in the terminal if it was vulnerable or not. Some exploits may pop up and say that it does not support the check. So here this is saying that this exploit would not be successful on this endpoint based on the information that it has. Okay, so it checked all these exploits against my host, and fortunately or unfortunately for this demonstration, the target is not exploitable for these exploits. If it were, it would show in green that yes, this target is exploitable. Then you could run that exploit against the machine to try to exploit it. If you want to just run an exploit, regardless of if it passes the check or not, right click on your machine, go to attack, and then just pick any of these exploits, and you can actually just click it and it will run the exploit. So here's a description of the exploit that it's going to attempt to run on my machine. I'll just hit launch. Definitely don't do this playing around in a production environment because it could be quite intrusive on your machines. So it looks like the exploit failed on this host in the lab. Sorry if you were looking forward to seeing me hack into one of my machines. I really just wanted to demonstrate Metasploit so that you had an idea of how you could play around with it and get to see for your own eyes how attackers could potentially try to compromise machines. Because the more you understand what an attacker could potentially do, the better you could protect your network as a cyber security engineer. Risk is what the potential for a threat to succeed is. For example, if you do not keep antivirus up to date in your environment, then your endpoints have a higher risk of being compromised. Back to the defense in depth concept, the more security layers that can be deployed on a network, the lower the risk is for an infection. Risk assessments can be done by third parties to assess your network to identify any vulnerabilities. Equipment inventory, software versions, and vulnerability scans are some common examples of risk assessment objectives. Once a risk is identified, it needs to be scored based on the likelihood of the risk and how much of an impact it would have. By prioritizing risks based on scoring, you can make an educated decision on what to fix first. Risk reduction can be achieved by procedures and equipment to combat security risks. Endpoint protection, software patches, and firewalls are all examples of risk reduction. In this section, we are going to cover some security terms that you should be familiar with for the CCNA CyberOps exam. Threat actors are the individuals responsible for an attack. So an individual hacker or a group of people that attack a network would be considered to be threat actors. Runbook automation is the ability to define, build, orchestrate, manage, and report on workflows that support system and network operational processes. Okay, so in layman terms, a runbook is simply documentation for tasks that an IT administrator carries out. So if a server needs to be added to the network, an administrator can reference the procedure to do so in a runbook. By following a runbook, you can be consistent with your operations, eliminate room for error, and improve the time it takes to complete tasks. To take this concept a step further, if a runbook is automated with software tools, then processes can be even more efficient. A chain of custody refers to the paper trail or physical and electronic evidence in a cyber forensics investigation. If you or your company is compromised, then it is important to preserve and copy evidence properly to maintain its integrity. Reverse engineering can be used to identify the details of a breach and how an attacker entered the system. Tools are available to debug, disassemble, and decompile data for reverse engineering things like encryption algorithms and malware programs. This can be a helpful cybersecurity technique for analyzing malware to identify its behavior and possibly the author of the program. Traffic anomalies are abnormal changes to the network traffic flows. This can be a major red flag in an enterprise network. Imagine that you had a web server that for years only communicated with web protocols like HTTP and HTTPS, and then all of a sudden it was sending large amounts of data using SSH. That would be a traffic anomaly. One of the main goals of cybersecurity is protecting sensitive data like personal identifiable information and protected health information. This information includes, but is not limited to, credit card numbers, social security numbers, and medical records. Due to the importance of PII and PHI, specific government and HIPAA regulations must be followed to secure sensitive information. The last security term I want to cover in this section is the principle of least privilege. The principle of least privilege enforces differentiated access to networks, meaning that users should only have access to the bare minimum resources that are required to perform their job duties. When a network is designed, groups should be defined to segment users so that access can be regulated. Just like users, programs should also only have the privileges needed to function. For example, you would not want all the programs on a device to have root access. If you've ever heard of a device being rooted or jailbroken, that means that all the apps have root access, which can leave a device vulnerable to threats such as malware. Access to network resources need to be handled securely by using access control models. These models help to enforce the principle of least privilege concept that was mentioned in the last video. Discretionary access control defines who can read or write to a resource based on the owner's discretion. For example, when an admin creates a SharePoint site with secure file resources, they can decide who has access to the site based on user group memberships to enforce access control. A more scalable method of securing access to resources is mandatory access control. With mandatory access control, the system itself controls who accesses resources, so you are not relying on the user that created the resource to permit access. Non-discretionary access control can be referred to as rule-based access control or RBAC, meaning that access to an object is based on certain rules. For example, a salesman would have access to sales files while the user maintains the role of a salesman, but would lose privileges to sales files if they were moved to the marketing department. So a user's role defines the access control rules. A level of management needs to be enforced in any network environment to maintain security and organization. Assets are things of value to an organization such as computers. Some common asset management documentation includes things like asset inventory, ownership, classification, and labeling. Configuration management is a set of policies and procedures for maintaining the integrity of a configuration item. A configuration item can be anything from a network router to an application. If configurations need to be changed, then a change control process should be followed to notify all parties of any changes. Then if there are issues with any systems after the documented changes, it is very easy to troubleshoot because you can start by rolling back whatever changed in the system, which is the root cause in most cases. Change control processes typically include a planning phase, detailed documentation of what time the change will be made, and an approval process. Patch management systems push out software patch updates to endpoints to fix software vulnerabilities and bugs. If a new threat is introduced that can affect PCs, then the patch management system can update endpoints to make sure that they are updated for risk reduction. Vulnerability management is integral to computer security and network security. It is the practice of identifying, classifying, remediating, and mitigating vulnerabilities. This can be done with active or passive vulnerability scanners, including penetration assessments. Pen tests identify vulnerabilities within an environment that need to be corrected. To keep things honest, these are typically conducted by a third-party company. Cryptography is used to secure communication between network devices. In this section, I will cover the concepts that are used for cryptography. Encryption is used to provide data confidentiality for securing communication between network devices. Without encryption, data is sent in clear text and can be seen by unauthorized users. When data is encrypted, it is sent as ciphertext and needs to be decrypted to be seen as clear, readable text. With encryption, keys are used to encrypt and decrypt data. One way to use keys for encrypting traffic is with symmetric encryption. This type of encryption uses the same key for encryption and decryption. Some examples of symmetric encryption are DES, 3DES, and AES. Another method of using keys to encrypt data is asymmetric encryption. Asymmetric encryption uses different keys for encryption and decryption.
An example of asymmetric encryption would be RSA.
With encryption, there are rules called ciphers. The different types of ciphers are substitution, polyalphabetic, and transposition. These ciphers just provide different ways to encode data. For example, a substitution cipher substitutes values. So ABC in clear text would be encrypted as NOP by simply substituting the letters with different ones based on the cipher values. Hashing provides data integrity to ensure that data has not been modified. Hashing is achieved by generating hash values for data that can be compared. If both sides compute the same hash value for transferred data, then the data has not been modified. If hash values do not match, then the data would be considered to be corrupt. Some hashing methods are MD5, SHA-1, SHA-2, and HMAC. PKI is another method for implementing cryptography. It is based on digital certificates that can be used for authentication and encryption. A PKI is built from a certificate authority to identify the organization that owns the digital certificates. Certificate authorities handle certificate signing requests for devices participating in the PKI environment. Every certificate authority has a root certificate that is used as the main top-level certificate. Once a root certificate has been generated, it can be used to sign all intermediate and client-level certificates. Once a client trusts a PKI root certificate, then it will also trust all of the certificates signed by that CA. To retrieve a signed certificate from a certificate authority, network devices can manually generate certificate signing requests. Certificate signing requests contain information about the network device, like a FQDN, which stands for Fully Qualified Domain Name. The CSR will also contain detailed information about the organization that owns the certificate. When a CSR is generated, a public and private key pair are created. Once the CSR is generated, it can be submitted to the certificate authority to be signed. Once the network device receives the signed certificate, it can be installed. So you can see a CSR actually be generated on a network device. I'm logged into a Windows web server, and we have the option to create a certificate signing request. So first we have to enter the common name, which is going to be the host name of the server. So if the server's name is web.cisco.com, then that's what we're going to want to enter for its common name. The full DNS name of this server is web.carry.home. Organization, we'll say home. IT, say San Jose. So now I've entered the information required for the CSR. Hit next. I want to say the bit length. I'll set it to 2048. Then we have to send the file somewhere. I'll just send it to the desktop and call it web CSR. So now the CSR is on my desktop. If I open it up, this is what the certificate signing request looks like. This text can actually be used to manually fulfill the certificate signing request on the certificate authority server. So I'm going to copy that. Now to fulfill my certificate signing request and get it signed by my certificate authority, I have web browsed to my certificate authority's IP address with the cert-serve path. Since this is a Windows certificate authority, I'm going to say request a certificate. This will be a advanced certificate request. Paste in my text from my CSR that I generated on my web server. And since this is a web server, I'm going to select the web server certificate template, hit submit, and now I have the option to download my certificate. I'm going to choose base 64. Save it to my desktop. So now I'm going to take this certificate, go back to my web server, and now I have the option to complete certificate request. It's going to ask for the file name. And then I'll call this web certificate. And there you go. Now I have completed my certificate request. You can see it was issued by my Active Directory root certificate authority. And now if I wanted to, I could assign the certificate as my web server's identity certificate for any HTTPS secure connections. In addition to a manual CSR, there is a protocol available called SEP, Simple Certificate Enrollment Protocol. SEP requests are sent via HTTP over the network and provide a way for network devices to automatically retrieve a certificate without manual intervention. Once a network device has a signed certificate, it is considered to be an identity certificate. Identity certificates can be used as a credential for authentication and to encrypt data. All identity certificates have an expiration date to control the validity of the certificate. So how do network devices use certificates? Let's first talk about how they can be used for encryption. A great example is a secure web server. Web servers that are accessed via HTTPS use their identity certificate to encrypt data for data exchanges with web clients. The server first responds to the client request with its public key and certificate. If the client trusts the CA that signed the web server's identity certificate, then the client continues to communicate and sends encrypted data back to the server using the public key to encrypt the data. Data that is encrypted with a device's public key can only be decrypted with the associated private key, which is only known by the server. This has been an example of asymmetric encryption, since different keys were used for encryption and decryption. Within the asymmetric encryption exchange, a symmetric key is secretly created, which then can be used to create a secure encrypted channel for the HTTPS session between the client and server. Let's take a look at a real-world example of how a certificate can be used by a secure web server to encrypt a session. When we go to secure websites with HTTPS, our web browsers have trusted root certificate authorities that they use to validate certificates that are sent in responses from secure servers. So if I go to my certificate store on this web browser and go to trusted root certificate authorities, here's the certificate authorities that my Google Chrome web browser trusts. So if I go to a secure website and the secure web server certificate that it presents was signed by one of these certificate authorities, then my web browser will trust the certificate and allow the connection. And as you can see here, usually you'll see a green certificate icon letting you know that your web browser trusts the certificate that the web server has responded with. So of course Google would be in my trusted root store, so if I click on that, go to details, I can actually view the certificate that Google responded with. So we can see that this certificate was issued to www.google.com, issued by the Google Internet Authority, and the certificate's valid until March of 2017. And then if we look at the details, we can see some encryption, algorithm information, and typically the actual name that the web browser is looking for the match for is within the subject or the SAN field. So for example, if I put in the IP address of google.com instead of this FQDN, then the web browser would not consider the certificate to be trusted because what I put in the web browser did not match what the certificate was provisioned for. So always know that you want your host name that you put in your URL to match what the certificate is set for, so that your web browser trusts the certificate. And we look at the certificate path. You can see the root certificate authority, then the intermediate authority. So the root signed a cert for this Google Internet Authority G2, and then this intermediate authority actually signed the identity certificate that the Google web server is using. Next, let's talk about how certificates can be used for authentication. An example would be for VPN connections. If a VPN client sends a certificate as its credentials, VPN gateways can authorize the VPN connection if it trusts the CA that signed the client certificate. Usernames within client certificate subject names can also be used for differentiated access. So for example, the VPN gateway could have an access rule that only allows the user JDoe to access routers on the network through VPN connections. If a certificate was assigned to JDoe, then their username would be within the certificate information and could be used to receive the special access. To police if certificates are still valid or not, certificates can be checked against a revocation list. And if a certificate has been revoked by a certificate server, then certificates can be denied by devices like firewalls that are checking them for authentication access. Certificates can be created in many formats based on several public key cryptography standards. This list of standards should be known for the exam. To better your abilities to understand computer threats and how to protect against them, you need to understand how a computer's operating system works. In this section, we're going to learn about Microsoft Windows and Linux operating systems. The most well-known and used computer operating system is Windows. I am assuming that all of you have used a Windows operating system at one point or another. But just in case you're not very familiar with it, let's take a tour of some of the programs that you can run on a Windows computer. Here we are on my Windows 7 laptop. The easiest way to navigate around the Windows operating system is to go to the Start button and then search for whatever program you're looking for. So for example, if I just want to find out basic system information for my Windows computer, I can type in System, and then it comes up with any options that have system in the name. So here I can see what version of Windows I'm running, as well as my processor and RAM information. This can be helpful information if you're investigating a security issue on a Windows computer, because then you'll know what vulnerabilities the computer may have based on its operating system version. So Windows 7 is going to have different vulnerabilities when compared to Windows 8 or 10. Of course, it's critical to keep your Windows operating systems up to date. From the system page on the left-hand pane, you can go to Windows Updates. And as you can see, I'm a little behind here, so I want to make sure to install these updates to make sure that my computer is protected for any security vulnerabilities out there. Other things I like to look at as far as security goes with Windows is the Windows Firewall and Windows Defender. Go back to the Start menu and just search for Firewall. Click on Windows Firewall. Here I can see if my Windows Firewall is enabled or not. As you can see, the Windows Firewall can help prevent hackers or malicious software from gaining access to your computer. You definitely want to make sure that your firewall is enabled. Windows operating systems come with Windows Defender, which is an additional layer of security for your computer. It helps to protect against spyware and potentially unwanted software. So this is another really good basic tool that you can use to help protect your Windows operating system. So far I've shown you the Windows Firewall and Windows Defender. Of course, in addition to those default security mechanisms, you're going to have some type of antivirus or anti-malware installed on your Windows device. That should be a given. If you don't have antivirus and anti-malware software running on your Windows computer, you will most definitely get infected and be vulnerable to exploits. My computer for antivirus is running the System Center Endpoint Protection from Microsoft. So I have that for real-time protection for antivirus, and then in addition to that, I'm running Malwarebytes for anti-malware and ransomware. So again, back to the defense in depth concept, you want to have multiple layers of security to protect your endpoints. One really good basic tool to use when you're working on a Windows computer is the command line prompt. So if you search for CMD and launch that, this is our command line prompt, and you can access files from here and do all sorts of things. Most of the time when I'm accessing the command line prompt, I'm looking for network information for the Windows device. So ipconfig/all is a really good command to run, and that'll give me some of my network information like IP address, my default gateway, DHCP server, DNS servers, the layer 2 MAC address for my network interface card. One of my favorite Windows tools to see what's going on with an endpoint is the resource monitor. So if we go to our start menu and search for resource, and then click on resource monitor, you can get a really good look into what programs are running on a device, what kind of resources they're using for CPU, memory, disk, and even network connections. So if I have a computer that has some suspicious activity going on, I could come in here to the network tab and see what connections are being made for which addresses and applications. In this video, we're going to take a look at some of the main Microsoft Windows components. Applications that are used within Windows, like Word and Internet Explorer, rely on processes. A process is an instance of a computer program that is being executed. A process may be made up of multiple threads. Threads are the individual program commands that are ran within a process. For example, when I launch my Notepad application, there would be multiple threads running to take care of each task. One thread could be used to collect data input to the Notepad file, while another thread could be used to save the data. To give you a better idea of how processes and threads work, I'm going to show you how to download and install a Windows tool called sysinternals. Sysinternals gives you the ability to drill down into some of the Microsoft Windows components that are running on your computer. If you just Google sysinternals and go to the Windows sysinternals webpage and then go to download, from there you can download the sysinternals suite of tools. So I'll click on that, and then it's downloading it into a zip file. I actually already have it installed. Once you locate your downloaded sysinternals zip folder, you're going to want to open it up, and then here are all the tools that you can choose from. To look at processes on Windows, you can use the Process Explorer tool. So I'll go ahead and extract that to my desktop. Go back, and here is what the Process Explorer application looks like. Let's go ahead and launch that. To give you an example of how you can drill down into see what processes and threads are running for an application, I'm going to launch notepad here. Here I found my notepad executable, and it shows me CPU usage, process ID, some basic information for the process. I'll right click and go to properties, and then it actually shows me the threads that are running for that application. So if I were to, for example, click on this help option, you can see that when I launch that from the application, it fired up additional threads since I'm doing multiple things within the application. And you'll even see a new thread pop up if I were to save the application. So I just did Control S and save, and you can see that now there's all these additional threads. So you can see how this tool can help you really drill into what's happening when you're using an application in regards to how processes and threads are working in the background. Computer memory is used to temporarily or permanently store information for applications. Processes use virtual memory, known as virtual address space. It acts as a reference point for physical objects in memory. For cybersecurity investigations, computer memory can provide a lot of valuable forensics information, such as active user sessions and port connections. The Windows registry contains settings for programs and hardware installed on Microsoft Windows operating systems. For example, when a program is installed, a new subkey containing settings like a program's location, its version, and how to start the program are all added to the Windows registry. To pull up the Windows registry, you can open up a command line prompt and enter the command regedit, or just search for regedit in your Windows search bar. Here in the registry editor, you can see that there's 5 folders. Each of these main folders are called hives. Each hive contains different registry entry types. For example, user-based settings would be set within the user hives, and hardware settings would be set within the local machine hive. Just to show you an example of some of the different types of registry settings that you could modify, I'll go to my mouse registry settings. The path is user, control panel, and then mouse. You can see all of these default settings in here. So it has yes or no for if extended sounds are enabled, beeping, the mouse speed and sensitivity, and by adjusting these values, I could modify the behavior of how my mouse program runs. WMI is only used on Windows systems. It defines a proprietary set of specifications that allow management information to be shared between management applications. It can be used for tasks like modifying system properties and pulling system information from devices. Although WMI can be very useful to IT administrators, it can also be used to conduct malicious acts, so access to WMI resources should be limited to only the required systems. As you can see in the slide, if you go to your Windows firewall settings, you have the ability to enable or disable WMI. Handles are used when applications reference objects like memory blocks or databases. As it relates to security, handles are at risk of causing memory leaks that are created when computers do not release handles that are no longer being used. To view handles that are associated to processes, you can either go to our Process Explorer, sysinternals tool that we looked at earlier, and again I'm clicked on the Notepad application, and down below here show the associated handles for that program. Another way you can view associated handles to processes is using the Resource Monitor tool. If you go to the CPU tab and then select the program that you want to view handles for, Down below you can see the associated handles with that program. Services are computer programs that run in the background. These services can be used as an attack vector. Some network services leave extra layer 4 ports open on endpoints like SNMP and RDP that can be used to gain access to a system. Services like these should be disabled if they are not in use. To view services, we can go to the Start menu and then just search for Services and click on View Local Services. So here's a list of services running on my computer. Here is my remote desktop service. So for my computer, I have no reason for myself or anybody to use remote desktop services and log into my computer remotely. So this would be a good example of a service that I would want to stop and keep disabled so it cannot be used as an attack vector to gain access to my computer. So if I wanted to stop the service, I can go to Stop, say yes, and this one is set to be manual for startup, but if I wanted to change that behavior, I could right click on it and go to Properties and then choose the startup type. In this section, we are going to cover Linux operating systems. Linux is an open source software used by many enterprise platforms. When compared, there are many differences between Linux and Windows operating systems. Linux is the clear winner in many categories as far as price, reliability, and security, but most environments use the Windows operating system for servers, laptops, and desktops because they are easier to use and manage. Earlier in this course, we learned how to install Kali Linux. You can use the Kali Linux terminal to follow along with the examples in this Linux section. You could use any Linux distribution, really, since you only need the terminal application. If you'd like to install a different version of Linux other than Kali, I have a download link in the resources section of this lecture. Ubuntu is a very common one. That's going to give you a nice GUI desktop that has its own version of like the Windows Office tools, so you can have Word documents and spreadsheets. Most of the time when you're working in Linux, you're going to be using the terminal program. To launch the terminal, you can just look in the left-hand pane and left click on terminal, or you can hit your search key on your computer. Like for Windows, if I hit the Windows key, it pulls up a search bar, and then I can just type in terminal and search for it. And this is what a Linux terminal looks like. It really is a new language that you have to learn. I also have a cheat sheet for Linux commands added as a resource in this lecture, so take a look at that. You can do stuff like ping IPs just like you could from any network device. You can look at your IP address with ifconfig. That's a pretty common one that you should know. Navigate file systems. Linux has most of the capabilities that your Windows or Mac operating systems have. It's just a little more difficult to use. Learning Linux is beneficial in the IT world alone because a lot of servers run on Linux operating systems. As far as cybersecurity goes, it's even more beneficial just because a lot of the cybersecurity tools that are available use Linux operating systems. In this video, we're going to cover some of the main Linux operating system components. In the Microsoft section, we talked about Windows processes. Linux operating systems also run processes, but they work a little bit differently. Linux processes are classified as either parent or child processes. Like you would probably guess, child processes are processes that are created from parent processes. When a parent process creates a child process, it is called a fork. Each process is assigned a unique ID. The init process has process ID of 1 because it is the only process that does not have a parent process and is at the top of the process tree. To view processes in the terminal, you can run the ps command, and then to see a list of available options for different data that can be provided from that command, you can run --help and then all, and then it gives you an explanation of the miscellaneous options that you can add to that command. If I scroll up here, you can see some more of the options that are available. I like to add the A, E, and F options, so I'll go ahead and do that by entering ps dash each miscellaneous option that I like to use, so A, E, F. And then here's a nice list of the processes running on my Linux operating system. And if I go to the top here you can see the process ID and then parent process ID. And then to see the relationship between processes, I run ps tree. And this is really cool because it gives you a nice visual representation of how everything's tied together between the processes. Operating systems can be used by multiple users at the same time. To decide between who can access what, file permissions are used to control access to system files. To maintain a secure system, these permissions must be as strict as possible to prevent malicious users from accessing resources. To see what permissions a file has, in Linux you can enter the terminal command ls. I like to add the -l command. The values in the left column represent the permissions for each file.
To modify file permissions,
you can use the chmod command. So in this example, I assigned the permission values 777 to the file named file. And as you can see, the highest permission that you can assign to a file is 7. 4 stands for read, 2 stands for write, and then 1 stands for execute. So using chmod 777 and the file name, you would provide full access to that file. One really valuable command in Linux is sudo, which stands for super user do. Some commands will not execute without super user rights. If a command needs to be used but the current user does not have permissions to the file, the sudo command can be used on demand to give a user super user rights. When the sudo command is entered, the user will be prompted to enter a user password that must be entered before the user rights are elevated. It is very common to encounter the sudo login requirement when you are using Linux terminal commands. Symlinks is short for symbolic links. So instead of entering a long path for a file or directory, you can use a symlink as a shortcut to access the file or directory. Okay, so here I am in my Linux lab machine. I'm going to create a directory with a really long folder path, and then I'll show you how to create a symlink so I can access the same directory but without entering a really long path. So first I'm going to enter the command mkdir, and I'm going to make a new directory called backups. And then to navigate to that directory, I'm going to use the command cd, which stands for change directory, which is another very commonly used Linux command. So I'll do change directory, and if I just hit tab, then I can see some of the directories that I can jump to based on where I am in my Linux terminal. And then I can either type in backups and hit / and enter, and that takes me right to my backups directory, or I'll go back to the beginning with just entering cd again, or I can just do cd and then part of the name of the directory, and then I can tab it out. And if I had folders within this backups directory, I could just keep hitting tab to navigate through them. So I'm going to enter my backups directory, and then I'm going to make another directory within there called Monday. And now if I hit cd and tab, you can see I can navigate to my Monday folder. And just to make this example match the PowerPoint slide, I'll go ahead and create new directories to match each weekday. Okay, so now we have our Friday directory, and you can see that if I wanted to navigate to that directory, even though I can tab it out, I have to remember this long path to get there. So now we'll create a symlink to access the Friday directory by using a shortcut word that we define within the symlink configuration. So before I create the symlink, I'm going to add a file to this directory so that we at least have something to list when we access it. The touch command will create a file. So I'll say touch, and then the file name will be file.txt. And now when I do ls-l in this directory, I have a file to reference here. So let me go all the way back to the beginning, and to make a symlink we'll use the command ln --s, the path of the original directory that we want to create a symlink for. So I'll say backups, and I'll just tab it all the way out, and then the name of our symlink or shortcut, and I'll call it Friday, if I can spell, Friday link. So now to access our symlink, I can simply just navigate to it just like I would any other directory. So I'll say change directory to Friday link, do ls-l to list the contents of that directory, and there you can see I have my file. So I was able to jump directly to this directory or folder with that shortcut symlink. The last Linux topic I want to cover is daemons. These are programs that run as background processes, and they are equivalent to services that run on a Windows operating system. One unique thing you should know about daemons is since they're system processes, their parent process is normally going to be the init process, which has a process ID of 1. Some common daemon examples would be things like DHCP, FTP, and SSH, and you'll notice that their names typically end with a D, as you see here. To protect endpoints from cyber threats, antivirus, anti-malware, and personal firewalls can be used. Here we are on the lab PC. I've downloaded Avast free antivirus just to show you some of the components that make up an antivirus software solution. Typically your antivirus software will be set up to run automatic scans, but you do have the option to manually run scans on your computer. We currently have a smart scan running that's checking for specific threats, and then if we wanted we could force a full scan to scan the entire system for viruses. If we look at our scan history on this PC, we see that luckily it has not found a virus on this computer. If I go to settings and update, I can see my virus definition download status. You always want to make sure that your virus definitions are up to date to make sure that you're protected against the latest vulnerabilities. So that's antivirus. I also have an anti-malware solution running on our lab PC. Same concept really, except instead of looking for viruses, it's looking specifically for malware files. We'll run a quick scan, and you can see that it's scanning specific files on my computer to look for any that are considered to be malware. If it finds files that are determined to be malware, then the files will be quarantined and removed from the computer. So you can see a malware transfer be detected by an anti-malware solution. I have a PC in the lab here that's running SourceFire's AMP for endpoints. So I'm just going to copy this malware to the desktop here, you can see right away that the SourceFire anti-malware software scanned this file and determined that it was malicious. One very effective way to protect endpoints is to stop external connections before malicious files can be downloaded. If a user cannot connect to bad sites, then in theory they are secured, even if their endpoint protection software is not running. Whitelisting and blacklisting destinations can be used for this type of protection. Centralized databases are used to maintain lists to identify if a network, URL, or domain name is good or bad. So basically, when an endpoint sends traffic on the network, your security devices can check these lists to know if it should permit or deny traffic. To show you how whitelists and blacklists can be used to secure your network, we'll hop into the lab and I'll show you Cisco's security intelligence feature. Okay, so here we are in my Firepower Management Center in the lab. First, I'll show you how you can apply the security intelligence feature for whitelists and blacklists by going to the access control policy that ties everything together. So here in my access control policy, you'll notice there's a security intelligence tab. I'm going to click on that. To the right, we have a whitelist and blacklist column. If I add a list of IPs or URLs to the blacklist column, that is going to tell Firepower devices on my network to block any destinations that match IPs or URLs that are blacklisted. And if we want things to be excluded from being blocked from a blacklist, then we would add those destinations to a whitelist. I've added some of the malicious categories in here, but really just by adding the global blacklist or global whitelist, you can dynamically block things that are considered to be bad out on the internet. So if Cisco's security intelligence database determines that some IP out on the internet is sending out malware, or that there's been reports of attacks from a certain destination, then they'll add that IP to their blacklist, which will be dynamically downloaded to Firepower. Okay, so now that you see how the whitelist and blacklist are applied within our policy, now I'll take you into our object page to show you where you can configure whitelist and blacklist objects. So we'll go to the Objects tab and Object Management, and then we'll go to our Security Intelligence objects, and we have our network, DNS, and URL feed. So not only is my Firepower device using Security Intelligence to see what networks and IPs are blacklisted out on the internet, but it will also check for blacklisted DNS entries and URLs. So here you can see I have the Security Intelligence feed that's pulling down any updates to my global blacklist or whitelist. So you can see here my feed was updated a little over an hour ago. And if you want to make a custom blacklist, maybe there's IPs out there that you've found to be malicious that aren't updated to the dynamic feed, then you can go to Network Objects, and then I could create my own blacklist group of IPs. We'll call this Custom Blacklist. And then any IPs that I find are malicious, I can just type them in here and click Add. Maybe I want to add networks. And save. And then I can add this custom blacklist to our blacklist security intelligence column. Then I'll go back to our access control policy, go to our security intelligence tab. Then I can add my custom list over to the blacklist column, telling Firepower to block anything that's on that list. But really the primary purpose of the security intelligence whitelist and blacklists is the dynamic feeds that downloading from Cisco's security intelligence database. Sandboxing is used to separate applications from secure resources. The idea is to let an application run in a secluded zone that cannot reach other systems. It can be implemented as a means to test new software or even to study the behavior of a malicious program. A lot of security products actually use sandboxing to identify if a program is a threat strictly based on behavioral indicators. So if I have a program running in a sandbox environment that is constantly scanning networks and running oddly, then it is likely that the program is malicious and should not be allowed on the network. Let's take a look at how Cisco AMP uses a sandbox environment to analyze files. Here I am in the Cisco AMP for Endpoints portal. One of my favorite features of the portal is the file analysis page. On this page, you can actually upload files that you're unsure of, and Cisco will run the file within a sandbox environment, and you can even watch a video of what happened when the file launched on a PC in the sandbox environment. So I do have a file that is suspicious to me, and before I run it in a production environment, I'm going to submit it to the file analysis page here, and we're going to see if the sandbox environment determines if this file is good or bad. Upload my file, and then once it finishes running the file in the sandbox environment, we'll look at the report for the file to see if it's malicious or not. Okay, so it looks like the sandbox environment finished analyzing this file we uploaded. It is red, which tells me that it has been identified as being a malicious file. I'll click on the report here. And we get a nice report on the behavioral indicators that were found when this file was ran in a safe sandbox environment. And it looks like this definitely is a malicious file. It shows that it's been flagged as a known Trojan. So fortunately, by utilizing a sandbox environment, I was able to determine that the file was malicious before it was launched on my network. In addition to network sandboxing, there's also what's called system-based sandboxing. Some system-based sandboxing implementations are available, like Google Chromium and HTML5. These methods of sandboxing introduce an entire layer of security around web browsers to protect connections to websites. Each time a new web browser tab is opened, a new process is created in its own sandbox. So even if you were to accidentally go to a malware site, the malicious data would be contained within the source browser tab and would not have access to other web pages or the local system. Logging is one of the most important functions of security. We should have detailed logs of everything on a network for security auditing and troubleshooting. If your network is attacked, you would want to be able to point to logs to identify the who, what, where, when, and why something happened. Each operating system has their own logging system. Windows logging information can be displayed from the event viewer. These logs consist of data like user login, logoffs, and system events. Let's hop back into the lab and I'll show you a live event viewer log from a Microsoft server. Here I have a remote desktop session to a Windows server, and to get to the event viewer logs, I'm just going to go to the start menu, and I could either click right on event viewer here since it's in my past applications, or like anything else, I could just search for it in my search bar and click on it to launch. So here's the event viewer dashboard. If you do the drop down for custom views, since this is an Active Directory server with multiple roles, I could actually look at specific logs for each service running on this server. So if I wanted to look at DHCP server logs, I can click on the DHCP server option and filter the logs for that role. In relation to security, if you go to Windows logs and security, it's going to filter to security events. These are very useful logs for investigating a security incident to see exactly when someone logged on and off the network. In addition to system logs, operating systems have specific logging information for different applications like web services. IIS is the Windows-based web server application, and like Apache web servers, it has access logs to record server activity. Linux also has its own version of system logs. If you use the command cd for change directory and then /var/log, that takes you to the Linux log directory. So that's the main path to get to all of the different system logs you'll find in Linux. And if you use the ls command like you see here, you can see all of the different logs that are stored. To see log output, you can use the command more and then the name of the log file. And as you can see here, you could scroll through logs for if you were troubleshooting something or doing an investigation. One really good log to know about when it comes to security in Linux is the authentication log, which is located in the auth.log file. As you can see here, this log can be used to audit user logins to the system. So if I was investigating a security breach and I wanted to see what user accounts logged into a compromised system, I could look at the auth.log file. Apache web servers are open source Linux-based systems. Apache access logs are used to monitor events on Apache web servers. These logs record and store information like source user IP addresses and the pages that they accessed. In the end of the last section, we talked about event monitoring with operating system logs. In this section, we are going to look at different types of data that can be collected from a network for security, investigations, and troubleshooting. In addition to operating system logging, there is network logging. Network logs are generated on devices like routers, switches, and firewalls. These logs provide information on network events such as firewall rule blocks, resource issues, and device configuration changes. So if I want to find out why the network is slow or if there was a security event, then I could use these logs to possibly find out what happened. Network logs are classified based on severities. For example, if a firewall reboots, it may be classified as an emergency. But if a VPN user logged in, that would be considered to be an informational log. For logging to be a reliable monitoring resource, you must have accurate time. If an event occurs at 1 a.m. on my system, but my log shows that it happened at 3 a.m. because the device's time was inaccurate, then it would be impossible to investigate an incident. Accurate time can be achieved by having network devices synchronize their time by using the NTP protocol. With NTP, client devices receive accurate time updates from NTP servers. So you can see NTP in action. I'll log into the core switch in the lab so you can see its current time compared to my computer time, as well as its NTP status and settings. So here's my core switch in the lab. If I run the command show clock, I can see that the time matches my accurate computer time. I could manually set my time on my network devices, but of course if they were to reboot or were down for a certain period of time, they would slowly drift away from having accurate time, especially with spring forward and fallback changes. So in my router configuration, I have added NTP server destinations. So I have this switch requesting time updates from these 4 NTP servers out on the internet. So if I run show NTP status, I can see that my clock is synchronized, and the NTP server it's currently syncing to is at this IP address. So I don't have to worry about anything. I know that when I look at my log on my core switch, is always going to match when the event occurred. So here you can see I have some local logs on this core switch. Now with local logging, you're always going to have a limitation on how much logging information you can store locally on the device. So best practice with logging, not only for network troubleshooting, but even more so for security, is to send your logging information to an external logging server. I actually have a logging application running on my computer here, so what I'll do is I'll send logging information from this core switch to my local computer, which in the real world you would normally have a dedicated logging server. I wouldn't recommend using a computer like I am. I just want to show you what it looks like to see a logging application on an external logging server. So here's my syslog server application. I'm going to generate some logging information on my switch. I'll go to configuration mode, and I will shut down a interface on my lab switch. So I'll shut down port 14 since it's not being used, and let's see what we get in the log. So as you can see, on my external logging server, it showed that my user account logged in and ran the shutdown command on interface 114. So as you can see, having an external database of auditing information can be very useful. So if somebody logged into my switch that wasn't me, I could look in my log server and see what time they logged in and what user account they used. Depending on how the logging server is configured, you could see logs from over a year's time, depending on how far you had to go back in time for a security investigation. Sometimes sifting through logs is not enough, and we need to retrieve raw data traversing the network. Packet captures provide the most detail when it comes to gathering data on a network. It is a raw capture of IP traffic with all the information you could ask for when troubleshooting or investigating a security issue. These captures can be fetched directly from network devices like firewalls and switches, or with a software tool running on a computer. The most popular packet capturing softwares are TCP dump and Wireshark. TCP dump is a utility that can be used on Linux and Mac operating systems. To show you how to use the TCP dump utility on a Linux machine, I'm going to use my Kali Linux box and start by launching a terminal. From the terminal, I'll use the command TCP dump, and then to capture, I'll use the -w command, then the name of the file. I'll just call this capture, and then you're going to want to make it a .pcap file. That's a file extension for packet captures. And then if I wanted, I could actually specify specific TCP ports, but I'm just going to hit enter and capture all data traversing my network interface cards. Okay, so now that the packet capture is running, I'm going to generate some traffic by launching a web browser. And then I'll just go to a website like Bing. Okay, so now that I've generated some data, there should be some traffic being captured. I'll hit Control C to end the capture, or Command C, and it shows that it captured 644 packets. To view the TCP dump, I'll use the TCP dump command again, then the -r command, and the name of my captured file. My screen's kind of small here, so it's not a very good view, but I could easily copy this and put this in a text file and take a closer look at it. And as you can see, all the raw IP packets that were being generated from my Linux machine was captured by the TCP dump utility. So I just showed you how to use the TCP dump utility on a Linux machine. Now let's use Wireshark on a Windows computer. To obtain a copy of Wireshark, you can go to the Wireshark website at wireshark.org. And it is a free download, so you would simply download it to your desktop, run through the wizard. I already have it installed, so I'm just going to launch it. The first thing you need to do in Wireshark is pick which network interface card you want to capture on. I'm using wireless currently, so I'll double left click on my wireless network interface card, and now the Wireshark software is capturing data that leaves my wireless network interface card. So if I wanted to, I could select one of these traffic flows, and then down below I can expand the Ethernet frame or IP packet information to really take a close look at the traffic. One cool thing about Wireshark is you can apply display filters, so if I only wanted to see what HTTP traffic my computer was generating, I could just type in HTTP, which is a predefined filter, hit enter, and now it's only showing me HTTP traffic that's running on my computer. So even though packet captures are very helpful for administrators, for troubleshooting, and for cybersecurity engineers for investigations, it can also be our worst enemy because a hacker could use a packet capturing tool to capture wireless or wired traffic being sent on the network. And that's why you want to make sure that you're always using encrypted protocols. For example, when you remotely access network equipment like firewalls, routers, and switches, you can use SSH or Telnet. SSH, of course, is encrypted and is the more preferred option, but if you were to use something like Telnet, a hacker could actually intercept your username and password since Telnet data is sent in clear text. Just to show you, I will filter our capture to Telnet traffic. I'll launch a Telnet session to my core switch, and I'll put in the username Cisco and password Cisco. So just now, my computer just sent a Telnet request and my username and password information in plain text. So now if we go back to our packet capture software here, if we look at these packet captures for my Telnet session, you can actually look through the raw data that was sent in my session. I can look and I can see the banner that was sent from the switch to my login prompt. And then you can see the data that was sent when I entered my username. I have a CISCO for my username. And then it shows my password as CISCO. So as you can see with this capture, if I was a hacker and I was able to somehow capture the data that was being sent for this Telnet session, I could easily look at the payload and see what username and password was sent to log in to the switch. When NetFlow was first put to use, it was mainly for simply gaining visibility into application bandwidth usage between IP addresses. Now it is rapidly rising as an integral part of security monitoring. Products like StealthWatch use NetFlow data to create a full picture of a network with drill-down security analysis features. Here is a StealthWatch dashboard. StealthWatch is a LANCOPE product which has been purchased by Cisco. It works by simply sending NetFlow data from all of your network devices to a StealthWatch collector, and it has the ability to correlate information and gives you context for IPs, users, and activity on the network. You can see on the top of the dashboard, it has a nice summary of the different attacks that exist on your network. The flow collection trend at the bottom of the dashboard can be helpful to see if there's anomalies on the network. So if normally I'm peaking my flows around 700, and then all of a sudden I have a day of 900 flows, then that to me would be a traffic anomaly, and I would want to drill into what users and IPs were creating all of these extra flows. Now let's take a look at how you can drill down into attacks that have happened on your network. We'll go to the Network tab and then Host. On the right side, we have a nice list of hosts on our network sorted by overall severity. So it looks like this top host here has had the most policy violations. So that might be a host that I want to dig into to see what kind of activity they've had on the network. If we look at the alarm section here, there's a list of how many events have occurred for each type of attack. I'm going to click on exfiltration and we'll drill down into this attack and try to see what IP address and user triggered this alarm. So it looks like we have one host that has had traffic that's matched exfiltration, and it looks like the host is part of our compliance systems group. I'm going to click on the host address. Well, this is interesting. I can see that that host is sending data to China, and the alarms it's been triggering is suspect data loss and data exfiltration. If I scroll down, I can even see what user account is being used for these exfiltration attempts. So just by analyzing that flow data, StealthWatch has been able to tie all these pieces together for me. And now I know that I need to remove this host and possibly user from the network. AVC, Application Control and Visibility, is another gadget on our security utility belt. AVC, not to be confused with NetFlow, only provides application metrics. This is valuable information for security monitoring because it allows you to see how much bandwidth each protocol is using on your network. In addition to monitoring with AVC, policies can be configured based on AVC data to filter or throttle malicious applications. In the lab, I have a Cisco router that's running NBAR version 2, which is what Cisco devices use to collect AVC information. Here I'm logged into the application visibility dashboard running on the router. As you can see, it gives a nice summary of application usage for traffic traversing this router. So if one of my routers had really high utilization with this AVC information, I could take a quick look and make sure that I had business applications using up the bandwidth instead of something malicious like a torrent download. Unfortunately, attackers have many ways to infiltrate a network undetected, which can obviously make it that much easier for them to succeed, and that much harder for us to catch them in the act. In this section, we're going to take a look at some of the techniques that hackers can use to bypass network security. Encryption is the most obvious way to bypass security devices. If an attacker gained access to a network and wanted to upload sensitive data to an external device, encrypted protocols like SSH, IPsec, and HTTPS could be used. HTTPS inspection is becoming a major requirement for enterprise networks to prevent these types of evasions. When you are investigating a security event, the source IP address of the attacker is important to know. Network address translations can also be used to avoid detection. If an attacker natted their IP, then it could be difficult to detect the real source of the attack. One way to combat against attackers using NAT is StealthWatch's NAT stitching feature. NAT stitching can be used to identify IP changes from NAT to track the original source IP to help prevent NAT changes from affecting security monitoring. One of the slickest methods I've seen used to hide from security devices is DNS tunneling. DNS tunneling is when an attacker leaks data outside of a network via DNS packets. Since the DNS protocol ports are pretty much guaranteed to be allowed on firewalls and IPSs, it's an easy way to leak data. Tor is a technique used by many to anonymously browse the internet by routing traffic through Tor relays. This way, victim networks cannot see the real public source addresses and therefore cannot track down attackers. For example, if you used a Tor browser to go to Google, and I was in San Jose, California, my traffic could be relayed through Europe before it was sent to the actual destination, and Google would think I was actually in Europe based on the IP information. Here I have a Tor browser that I downloaded just so you can see what it looks like. If you check the resources for this section, I'll have a link so you can download this Tor browser. So if you want to see what public IP address your computer is being natted to, you can do what's my IP. So this shows that my IP address is 176.31.39.249, which I can assure you is not the IP address that I'm connecting to the internet with from my home network. So this clearly shows me that my traffic is definitely being tunneled through a Tor relay. So if I wanted to be hidden from the internet, I could use this Tor browser to surf the web, which I'm not going to because I do not do anything malicious. But again, like you may have heard me say before, the more tools you can see that malicious users might use, the better it is to understand what type of things you need to look out for and protect your network against. Our last monitoring challenge we're going to talk about is peer-to-peer traffic. Network resources are typically shared with a client-server model. P2P networks allow clients to transfer data directly between each other. This becomes a monitoring challenge because traffic becomes decentralized and increases the potential for vulnerable sources. Next generation firewalls like Cisco Firepower devices support features like IPS, anti-malware, and URL filtering. These devices are centrally managed by Cisco Firepower Management Centers. FMCs have multiple pages that can be used to display detailed event information. To view the different event types in the Firepower Management Center, you can go to the Analysis tab and then toggle through the different event pages. Let's take a look at a next-gen IPS event by going to Intrusions and Events. This page displays any IPS events that have been discovered on the network. If you right-click on an IPS event, you have the option to change the behavior of the rule, look at rule documentation, or even open up a Context Explorer for a detailed look into the event. The Context Explorer page takes the next-gen event data and translates it to easily readable graphical information. So as you can see, next-gen IPS events go above and beyond the traditional firewall events that we would typically see in a log and make security monitoring really simple. One concept you should be familiar with when it comes to the Security Fundamentals exam is attack surface analysis. An attack surface is all the different ways that an attacker could get into a system and where they could get data out. Knowing this information can help developers to properly secure applications to prevent attacks. Attack surface analysis is usually done by security architects or pen testers, and it will identify what parts of the system need to be tested for security vulnerabilities, what areas of the code should be considered high risk, as well as when you should reevaluate the application. Here in this article by OWASP, the Open Web Application Security Project, it has a lot of great information about defining the attack surface of an application, as well as identifying and mapping the attack surface. If you want to learn more about attack surface concepts, I added a link to this article in the resources for this lecture. In this section, we're going to cover different methods that can be used by attackers to compromise networks and endpoints. Let's get started with network attacks. A reconnaissance attack would be the first move that attackers would make to gather information about a network. Nmap is probably the most popular network scanning tool out there. To demonstrate Nmap, I'm actually going to use Sparta in our Kali Linux lab, which basically takes Nmap discovery information and displays it in a nice GUI application. In Kali, if you go to Applications and then Information Gathering, you can see some of the different reconnaissance tools that you can use, including Nmap and Sparta. I'm going to go ahead and click on Sparta, and then I'll run a scan on some devices in the lab. Now that Sparta has launched, I am going to click here to add a host range. I'm actually just going to scan a subset of my devices, put in my range and hit add to scope. And as you can see down below, it's starting to run Nmap on that network range. This scan will take a while to finish, so I'm going to pause recording and we'll pick back up once we have the scan results. Okay, so the Nmap scans are complete. There are some other tools that Sparta runs on the defined host range. NITGO is a vulnerability assessment tool, and then it runs screenshot, which will take a screenshot of web pages that are open, as well as some SNMP checks. But I mainly wanted to just show you the Nmap results. So as you can see in my host column, it did discover some hosts. It shows their host name as well as the operating system on some of the hosts. So this host is a Microsoft Windows server that I have running in the lab. So Nmap was able to discover ports and services that are running on that server. So if I was targeting this network, just based on running this Nmap scan, I know what type of operating system this host has, as well as services that I could try to exploit. Denial of service or distributed denial of service attacks are both ways to overload a network or server. These network attacks can be launched with the sole purpose of bringing down a network, but can also be used as a method to overwhelm a system to make it vulnerable to other attacks. The main difference between standard denial of service attacks and distributed denial of service attacks is with the number of attackers that are participating in the DOS attack. Let's take a look at some of the types of denial of service attacks. ICMP floods can be used by simply sending a large number of ping requests to the target with a spoofed source address. These can be prevented by blocking unnecessary ICMP traffic on firewalls. SYN floods take advantage of the TCP three-way handshake by sending a flood of TCP SYN requests without replying to the SYNAC responses, forcing the victim to generate a large amount of unneeded traffic. Most firewalls can protect against SYN floods by simply setting limits for SYN activity. DNS amplification attacks are the most common DDoS attack. It takes advantage of recursive DNS servers by sending a large amount of DNS requests for the victim's IP. This type of attack can be prevented by making sure that DNS servers are hardened and do not have recursive lookups enabled if they are unneeded. Man-in-the-middle attacks are when an attacker finds a way to place themselves in between a client and their gateway. When this occurs, client data is sent through the attacker's device before it is forwarded to the actual destination. This can lead to data exfiltration, denial of service, and password theft. Let's take a look at some common man-in-the-middle attacks. ARP poisoning can be used by attackers by responding to ARP requests to gateways. causing the victim to send all of their data to the attacker. ARP poisoning can be prevented with Cisco switches by enabling the dynamic ARP inspection feature. This feature ensures that malicious ARP responses are not forwarded across the switch. Another common man-in-the-middle attack is DHCP spoofing. With DHCP spoofing, an attacker would respond to DHCP requests to trick clients into receiving IP addresses from their scope, which could then cause the client to send gateway traffic to the attacker. This attack can be prevented with a Cisco switch feature called DHCP snooping. DHCP snooping ensures that only valid DHCP server responses are forwarded across the switch. The last man-in-the-middle attack that I want to cover is SSID injection. This attack can be accomplished by simply deploying a rogue AP with the same SSID as company broadcasted SSIDs. To avoid SSID injection, make sure to have proper wireless alerts set up so that you're notified if there's rogue APs in the environment, and make sure to have strong authentication policies that would make it difficult for an attacker to replicate. Since web applications are commonly open to anyone on the internet, they are always a major target by attackers. In this lecture, we're going to take a quick look at some of the most well-known web attacks. SQL is a method for talking to databases that can be used as an attack vector. SQL injection is an attack that executes malicious SQL statements and can potentially read or modify sensitive data. Cross-site scripting enables attackers to inject client-side scripts into web pages that can be used to attack users accessing the same website. Similar to SQL injection, command injection attacks are when an attacker sends malicious commands to vulnerable applications. If successful, this attack method can allow attackers to gain unauthorized access to system data. Here are a few ways to help secure web applications. So of course, good code, strong passwords. Want to make sure to run vulnerability scans constantly to see what vulnerabilities are open on your web applications and prioritize those vulnerabilities. Firewall hardening, and last but not least, IPS. Let's hop into the lab and I'll show you some of the web application specific IPS signatures that can be configured on Cisco Firepower devices. So here in my IPS policy, I went to rules and then classifications, and then I filtered the rules for web application attacks. Right on the first page, you can see some cross-site scripting signatures. Definitely want to have those enabled. And then if I go to the last page, you'll see that there's also some SQL injection signatures. Social engineering has become the most common attack method. With these attacks, hackers can use emails and websites to try to steal information from users. Phishing is a social engineering attack that uses emails to trick users into clicking on malicious links or attachments. Let's hop into the Kali lab and I'll demonstrate how an attacker could use a phishing attack. So what I'm going to demonstrate is how an attacker could create a fake website and use it to harvest credentials. So in Kali, we'll go to Applications, Social Engineering Tools, and then the Social Engineering Toolkit. Then we'll select option 1. Here's a list of social engineering attacks you could do with Kali. We're going to do website attack vectors. Then we'll select option 3 and site cloner. So the site cloner attack has the ability to actually clone a website page, which could then be used to direct people to your version of the web page, which could be used to harvest credentials. So what I'm going to do in my lab, I'm not doing this actually outside in the real world because I'm just doing this for demonstration purposes. I'm going to clone the Facebook login page, and then I'll access that page, put in my credentials, and then show you how you can see what credentials are entered into the fake web page in Kali. So let's get started. We'll go to Site Cloner. So now it wants us to put in the IP address that we would want to direct people to for this web page. So I'm just going to use the local IP address of my Kali box, since I'm only going to be testing it locally. Alright, so I'm going to copy my Kali IP address, close this window, paste that in. Now we just need to put in the URL of the website that we want to clone, which in my case is going to be Facebook. Hit enter. So at this point, if I were to web browse to the IP address of my Kali box, I should get the Facebook login page. I'll put in credentials, and then we'll be able to see which credentials were entered. So I'll minimize this, pull up a web browser, and I'll put in the IP address of this Kali box. And there you go, I have a Facebook login page. So this looks legitimate. To be honest, if I was redirected to this page, regardless of the URL being different, I would probably look at this and just put in my credentials. So let's do that. Let's put in Kali@gmail.com, and then on password I'll just do Cisco and hit login. And then it just fails and takes you directly to the Facebook page. So what would happen here is the victim would put in their credentials, get redirected to the actual Facebook page, log in, and not know the difference. They would have no idea that they just entered their credentials on a fake website. So let's minimize this and go back to our terminal. And here you go. I now have harvested the credentials that were entered on that login page. So you might be thinking to yourself, well, that's great. An attacker could just launch this locally, but all an attacker would have to do to make this actually work in the real world would be to create some hyperlink, email it to you, have the email tied back to Facebook somehow. They click on that link and would then be connected to the fake web page. So please do not use this in the real world. I am only showing you this so that you understand what attackers can do and how easily they could use a phishing attack to steal somebody's credentials. In this section, we're going to take a look at some of the common endpoint-based attacks. Buffer overflows are a potential danger to software programs and is probably the best known software vulnerability. A buffer overflow is when a computing device's buffer has more data than it can handle, or when the program puts data in memory past the buffer. If this occurs, the program could crash, corrupt data, or cause the execution of malicious code. Back in 1988, the Morris worm used this vulnerability to take down most of the internet. Wait, so the internet existed back in 1988? Command and control is an attack when CNC servers remotely send malicious commands to a botnet or a compromised computer. CNC is an easy way for an attacker to execute a DDoS attack. Imagine the power someone would have if they were controlling thousands of endpoints across the globe. They could send commands to all of the compromised computers, instructing them to send large amounts of data to targeted hosts. CNC connections can be blocked by Cisco Firepower devices with the Security Intelligence feature. Here you can see in my lab network, I have tons of potential CNC connections being blocked from IPs that have been added to the Cisco Security Intelligence blacklist in the C&C category. Now let's learn about the infamous malware, aka malicious software. One of the main goals of an organization is to prevent malware from being downloaded to network devices. Once malware is launched, numerous attacks can be executed on the installed equipment. One of the most popular forms of malware today is called ransomware. Ransomware can be used by attackers to encrypt data on computers and threaten to erase it unless they are paid to decrypt it. Let's hop into my lab sandbox and I will show you what happens when the infamous WannaCry ransomware is executed on an endpoint. Okay, so here we are in my sandbox. I'm going to launch the WannaCry ransomware software. Here I have a picture and a test zipped folder currently in my documents, and we'll see what happens when this ransomware is launched. My computer's being kind enough to warn me not to launch this, but I'm going to run it anyways since this is a sandbox environment. This is actually a VM, so I'm just gonna revert it to a snapshot once I'm done playing around with this ransomware here. Okay, so now the ransomware has been executed, and as you can see, it's encrypted my picture file as well as my test file zipped folder. So I'm going to try to view this picture that I had in my documents, and we'll see what happens. So as you can see, I cannot open this picture up. Let's try to open the zipped folder. Now that I've tried to launch those files, you see that they've disappeared out of my documents folder. If I read this "please read me" message, the attackers were kind enough to leave instructions on how to decrypt my files. So they're asking for Bitcoin. And if I launch the other file, we get this nice pop-up for instructions on how to pay in Bitcoin to decrypt my files. And then they're even kind enough to have another message in the background saying, "Oops, your important files are encrypted." So now you've been able to see for yourself what ransomware can do and how big of a concern it can be for businesses out there. If a company's computers happen to be infected with this, then they could potentially lose a lot of sensitive data. And this is another great example of why you should always have an anti-malware solution on endpoints. A rootkit is a collection of malicious software designed to enable root access to a computer while hiding its presence or identity from antivirus software. There is software available that can be ran to detect the presence of rootkits on an endpoint. For Windows, you can use the sysinternals tool Rootkit Revealer, and in Linux, you can install RK Hunter. When an attacker gains access to a network, there are many ways to cover their tracks so they cannot be detected by security equipment and forensics. In this section, we are going to cover the different methods that attackers can use to limit their exposure on a network. Encryption and tunneling are the most common tricks that attackers use to hide their actions. VPN and SSH protocols can be used to encrypt data, which can be impossible to decrypt for security devices like IPSs and firewalls. If an attacker wanted to leak stolen data outside of a network, they could simply form an encrypted tunnel back to their network with no one knowing it. There are many hacker tools out there, in addition to VPN and SSH clients, that can be used for secure tunneling, like the LAN turtle. When security appliances like an IPS are overloaded, it may cause them to fail open and let traffic bypass without inspection. By executing a DOS attack, a system's resources could be exhausted, which could trigger a fail open scenario. The best way to prevent resource exhaustion is to make sure that your security devices are set to throttle traffic within standable thresholds. Let's hop in the Kali lab and I'll show you an example of a tool that can be used to cause resource exhaustion on a system. First, we need to download the Solaris, or however you say it, application. So just Google Solaris, download, go to GitHub, and then it gives us instructions on what we need to download first, and then how to execute the Solaris script. So first I'll run through these apt-get commands. Get a terminal open. Once that finishes, we'll install Perl. Perl is a programming language that will be used by Solaris. Okay, so we got Perl. Then we just need to install these next two modules. Now we just need to download this Perl script. I'll download the zip file. Going to extract the Perl script, and then I'll just extract it to my desktop so it's easy to find. Alright, so now that we have the file extracted and we know the location, open up our terminal, go to the path where our Perl script is so we can launch it. Now we'll launch a terminal, navigate to my desktop directory, and then I'll paste in the string to run the attack. I'm going to put in an IP address on my lab network and then hit enter. And here you can see what it's doing is it's building as many sockets as it can to that server on port 80 to try to exhaust the resources of that server. So here I've browsed to that server's web page and I can't even see any of the images that I would normally see for this web page. So clearly its resources are being exhausted from our Solaris attack. Here I'm remotely logged into the server that's being attacked. I'll run the netstat command. So as you can see, our attacking station at IP address 10.0.11.11 has opened up a ton of port 80 sockets to the server to try to exhaust its resources. Our next evasion method is traffic fragmentation. When data is sent on networks, it can be sent with different byte sizes. If data is larger than what's called the maximum transmission unit for an interface, it needs to be fragmented. Traffic fragmentation is undesirable on networks for optimization reasons, and it is even worse for security. Attackers can intentionally fragment data certain ways to trick security equipment, like IPSs, to bypass inspection. Network communication is not possible without using protocols. Protocols are used to standardize how data is exchanged between network devices. Security devices inspect protocol data based on industry standards. And if an attacker modifies protocol behavior, it could trick security devices and make it difficult to inspect data. Traffic substitution and insertion can also be used to evade security sensors. Traffic substitution and insertion is when data is sent in a different format than expected and can cause an IPS to miss malicious payloads. The last evasion method I want to cover is pivoting. Pivoting means to attack systems with the intention of jumping to other systems on the same network. To prevent pivoting, network endpoints should be segmented to only have access to required services for wired, wireless, and VPN access. Interpreting the output report of a malware analysis tool can be extremely helpful when you are trying to find the root cause of an attack. AMP Threat Grid and Cuckoo Sandbox are both tools that can be used to analyze malware. AMP Threat Grid analyzes suspicious behavior in your network against more than 450 behavioral indicators and a malware knowledge base sourced from around the world. As a result, AMP Threat Grid provides accurate, context-rich analytics into malware. It can be delivered as either a cloud-based or on-prem solution to help organizations understand what malware is doing or attempting to do, how large a threat it poses, and how to defend against it. Let's take a look at how to analyze a malware analysis report using AMP Threat Grid. I am just going to pick a random file out of the global list of files that have already been analyzed. So as you can see, there is all sorts of good info displayed in this report. Behavioral indicators, which is a list of all of the suspicious activity found while running the file in the sandbox environment. Network activity information can be used to see if the file triggered external CNC connections or scans to other devices on its network. You can also see the processes that were active after the file was launched to help pinpoint what it was trying to accomplish, such as changing firewall rules on the machine it was installed on. Registry changes and file system changes are both key pieces of information. Here I can see which registry entries were modified, as well as file system activity for both read and modified content. Taking the time to analyze files that have been involved in a security incident can not only help you identify what the file was trying to do locally, but it can also show you other places in the system or network that could have been affected. In this section, I'm going to talk about the Common Vulnerability Scoring System version 3.0. The CVSS provides a way to capture the characteristics of a vulnerability and produce a numerical score reflecting its severity. The numerical score can then be translated into a representation such as low, medium, high, and critical to help organizations properly assess and prioritize their vulnerability management processes. You can find information about the CVSS by going to www.first.org/CVSS. Let's take a look at the factors used for the calculations to determine vulnerability scoring. An attack vector is the path that an attacker uses to access a system for malicious activity. This could be an email, an open layer 4 port, or a web page. This score increases the more remote an attacker needs to be logically or physically to use an attack vector. Attack complexity describes the conditions that are outside of an attacker's control to exploit a vulnerability. So if an attacker had access to a network all of the time, then the attack complexity would be low. But if an attacker had to wait for a certain condition to arise, like a pivot point, then the attack complexity would be high. Privileges required describes the level of privilege that an attacker must have before exploiting a vulnerability. So if a system requires admin credentials for access, then the risk would be low, but if a system only required basic user credentials or no login at all, then the risk would be high. User interaction describes the requirement for some type of user activity before an attack can be launched, such as a user login. This score is highest when no user interaction is required. The scope of an attack refers to the ability for an attack to affect other resources separate from the original target. An example would be an attacker compromising a web server and then corrupting the database server by pivoting from the web server. Then finally we have the CIA triage of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. You've probably learned about these topics in earlier security studies, but just as a refresher, confidentiality refers to limiting information access. Integrity refers to the trustworthiness of information. And availability refers to the loss of availability of the impacted components. To calculate your vulnerability score, you simply just have to select the values for the base metrics, and the website will generate a score for you. So let's say my attack vector had to have local access. The attack complexity is high privileges required, user interaction, then we'll say scope changed, and then our CIA will be high all the way through. So with these values, we have a score of 7.2 in the high range. One of the coolest things on this website are the example scores. So if you go over here to the CVSS version 3.0 examples, it actually takes you through some vulnerability examples and how the scores were determined based on the criteria for the vulnerability. So let's take a look at this one. Here we have a reflected cross-site scripting vulnerability. And I'll kind of just skip down to the version 3.0 base score. And let's read through each metric and the comments to see why it determined the value for each metric. So for attack vector, it chose network because the vulnerability is a web application and reasonably requires network interaction with the server. Attack complexity is low because the attacker would need to perform some type of reconnaissance attack on the targeted system. Privileges required, the value is none because an attacker requires no privileges to mount an attack. User interaction required. A successful attack requires the victim to visit the vulnerable component by clicking a malicious URL, for example. Scope is changed because the vulnerable component is the web server running the PHPMyAdmin software, and the impacted component is the victim's browser. The confidentiality impact is low because even though the information in the victim's web browser can be read and sent to an attacker, it is constrained to certain information. The integrity impact is low as well because the information maintained in the victim's web browser can be modified, but only information associated with the website running PHPMyAdmin. And then finally we have none for the availability impact because it does not have a major impact on the availability of the victim's system. So take some time and look through these different examples. It really helps to provide some context for each metric and what type of value you should be chosen based on each scenario. To be able to obtain forensics evidence during a cyber breach investigation, you should understand how endpoint file systems work. So what is a file system? Think of them as digital filing cabinets. When you store data on your computer hard drive or flash drive, file systems are used to divide it into organized units that can be accessed later on. This can be accomplished in many ways depending on the type of file system that is used. Back in the day, File Allocation Table, or FAT, was the default file system used by Microsoft operating systems. FAT organized data by splitting disks into clusters with a table to reference what was stored where. Over time, newer versions of FAT were introduced, such as the more recent FAT32. FAT32 overcame some of the earlier FAT version limitations, but still lacked in size capacity, making it not suitable for newer systems. As an alternative to FAT, Microsoft introduced the New Technology File System, or NTFS. NTFS is more secure and scalable than FAT, making it the clear winner and has been used since Windows XP as the Microsoft OS file system. NTFS keeps track of timestamps of any changes to a file system. Each file has a timestamp for create, modify, access, and entry modified. As you would expect, time is crucial across all aspects of cybersecurity. If there is any file activity on a compromised device, the time of the activity could be the smoking gun in a breach investigation. If you go to Computer Management on a Windows device, and then go to Storage and Disk Management, you can see what file system is used for each type of drive. As you can see here, I have my main hard drive, which is using NTFS as its file system, and then I have an external storage device that uses exFAT, which is another version of the FAT file system. Next, I want to open up a file that has been modified on my system to show you where you can look at timestamp information for files on a Windows computer. So I'll go to my desktop, and I have this test text file. Just by hovering over it, I can see that it was last modified on October 30th at 10:32 p.m. So if I was doing an investigation and found new files on the system, or wanted to see if critical documents were accessed or not, I could right-click on that file, go to Properties, and then I can see the last time it was created, modified, and accessed. So I'm going to open up that file and I'll make a change, and we should see it update to today's date, which is November 21st of 2017. So we'll modify the file, click Save, exit out of there, and then let's go back to the properties of that file. And now you can see that the modified date has been changed. So that's just a really basic thing to know if you're not that familiar with file systems on Windows computers. That can be very helpful for computer forensics. In the last video, we talked about Microsoft file system fundamentals. Linux operating systems also have their own version of file systems. X4 is the successor Linux file system to X3 and its earlier predecessors due to its larger capacity and performance capabilities. The X4 file system maintains a special file called a journal. A file system journal is used to record data so that even in the event of power failures or system crashes, the file system can be restored to a previous state. Journaling also provides data integrity to ensure that data has not been tampered with. When X4 file systems are partitioned, the information is held within the master boot records. The MBR, also referred to as a bootloader, contains executable code to function as a loader for the installed operating system. Linux file systems have two main partitions: data and swap. Swap space that is held within the swap partition holds additional RAM that can be used by the system if needed. The purpose of swap space is to help the Linux system operate, but it can also be used as a forensic tool because anything stored in RAM could also be stored in swap. So this means that valuable system data such as emails, credentials, and plain text data can be analyzed in swap as part of a forensics investigation. If you want to view a summary of swap space usage by device, you can use the command swap on summary. In this section, we are going to discuss collecting evidence after a security event. In some cases, the evidence collected may need to be used in the court of law, so it is crucial that the proper procedures are followed. The best evidence is evidence that is in its original form, such as a copy of a hard drive from a computer that has been compromised. Corroborative evidence is evidence that is based on a theory that is supported by the initial case evidence. Indirect evidence is evidence that is dependent on a connection to additional evidence, such as fingerprints or DNA left at the scene. Once evidence is collected, it needs to be handled properly to make sure it is not altered or damaged. First, evidence should be labeled with the investigator's name, the date, and case number. Then it should be preserved with right protection and placed in an anti-static bag or Faraday cage to prevent electric energy from harming the evidence. Finally, you need to make sure to maintain the proper chain of custody by accurately documenting any transfers of evidence. If you do not follow these steps, then evidence may not be valid in the court of law. A common piece of evidence obtained during most investigations are disk images. Some common tools out there that can be used for disk imaging are SandSift, Kane, and Encase. A disk image is a computer file containing the contents of a data storage device, such as a computer hard drive. It is important that when doing computer forensics, images are not altered. In a real-world scenario, if you were to get evidence from a search warrant or by a discovery motion, and were to obtain a physical copy of a hard drive from a computer, you would need a write blocker. Write blockers are devices that allow you to get information on a drive without accidentally damaging the drive contents. If you want to learn more about disk imaging, check out the link that I have provided as a resource for this lecture. When an intrusion event occurs on the network, it needs to be analyzed to determine the who, what, where, and when things happen. Network intrusion analysis primarily uses information like IP addresses and port numbers to track security events. Here is a list of some of the common types of information that we are looking for while analyzing network intrusions. Here is the intrusion analysis page used by Cisco's Firepower Management Center. As you can see, there is detailed information for each intrusion event. Let's click on one to take a closer look and see what type of security event artifacts can be found. So here on the detailed network intrusion analysis page, I can see when events occurred, the source and destination hosts that were involved in the event, as well as layer 4 port numbers and application protocols. Collectively, these common security artifacts can be used to analyze intrusion events. Intrusion devices also have the ability to analyze more than just data payloads, such as protocol headers. Protocol headers are used to carry network model layer protocols like IP, TCP, and HTTP. Preprocessors that analyze header information can detect attacks that exploit things like IP fragmentation, checksum validation, and TCP or UDP sessions. In the next video, we will analyze an intrusion event with a PCAP file and drill into protocol headers and some of the other common security artifacts. The most detailed type of analysis data are packet captures. With packet captures, you can see all of the network layer information plus actual data payloads. You can analyze information like web page images, passwords, and even voice call conversations. Cisco's Firepower Management Center has a sweet feature that actually allows you to download packet capture files for intrusion events. So I'll find the event I want to analyze, left click the drill down arrow, and then if I scroll to the bottom, I have the option to download all packets. So I'll download this, and then we'll use our Wireshark software to open up the PCAP file to analyze the security artifacts. While that's downloading, if we look here in this packet information section, right from the Firepower Management Center, we can actually look at some of the data that we would see right in our PCAP file. So I guess in this case, you really could probably get by just by using the data that's provided in the Firepower Management Center, but you're not always going to have that luxury. Plus, Wireshark has some additional features that can be used to help you analyze the data. Okay, so it looks like the download is done. I'll open up the zip file, double click it, and it should open up the file with my Wireshark software. So we can see that the first packet that was collected in the security event was the acknowledgement to open up the TCP session on port 80 to the web server. And then once the connection was established, we can see that there was an HTTP GET, and we can see our protocol header information and all of our addressing for each network model layer. And then the most interesting part is the HTTP section. It can provide information such as images that were pulled down in the HTTP GET, as well as the full destination URI and the DNS hostname information. So as you can see, having a PCAP file of a security event can give you all the information that you would need to properly analyze it at a network level. NetFlow version 5 record data is commonly used to analyze security events. Here's a list of traffic flow data that can be provided by NetFlow version 5 records. This type of information can help to identify traffic anomalies and many cyber attacks. To be able to quickly investigate security events, it is important to know where to start. With so many source technologies that can be used to obtain event data, it can be overwhelming. In this video, we are going to break down which source technologies should be used for each event type. Anomaly detection can be one of the most difficult events to detect. Dramatic changes in network behaviors need to be correlated to confirm these events. NetFlow data is a perfect feed of the type of information needed to accomplish this. For example, if NetFlow data is used to monitor data usage to a web server, then you'd be able to identify spikes in traffic to the server. If HTTP traffic between the internal network and the web server is at an average of 50 megabits per second, but then one day shows that it's hitting 200 megabits per second, then that NetFlow data could trigger an anomaly detection event. Intrusion events, as you probably guessed it, are detected by IDS and IPS devices. Any packets traversing the network that match intrusion signatures will be visible in the IDS or IPS event logs. Firewall events such as denial of service attacks, SYN floods, and port scans can be discovered from firewall logs. Network application control, also referred to as AVC, can detect malicious applications. Proxy logs can be used for identifying malicious website activity. And finally, antivirus can be used to detect suspicious program activity. IPS signature matches are classified as one of the 4 types listed in this slide. False positives are the main reason that we implement IPS tuning and could potentially drop normal traffic. Ideally, there would only be true positive and true negative matches. That is what we want the IPS to achieve 100% of the time. The IPS tuning process can be used to help ensure that the alerts you are seeing are real, actionable information. Without tuning, you will potentially have thousands of benign events, also known as false positives, making it difficult for you to conduct any security research or forensics on the network. Cisco's Firepower system actually has an auto-tuning feature that will tune IPS policies to match the traffic in your environment. So here I am in the IPS policy configuration in Firepower. And if you click on Firepower recommendations, you can actually set your IPS policy to be based off of traffic that Firepower has learned about. So based on the traffic in my network, there were 139 rules set to only alert, and then 5,354 set to drop and alert, and then almost 14,000 rules were disabled because based on the traffic flows through my sensors, Firepower determined that those rules were not necessary to be enabled. So this can really improve performance and make sure that you don't have so many false readings when you're analyzing intrusion events. To help simplify intrusion analysis, the Cisco Firepower Management Center uses impact flags. Impact flags are used to help you evaluate the impact an intrusion has on your network by correlating intrusion data, network discovery data, and vulnerability information. Here on the Firepower Management Center summary dashboard, you can see that the intrusion event widget breaks down each event in impact flag categories. So if I see anything in the 1 category, I know that there's a vulnerability mapped to the host that was involved in the event, and I might want to take a closer look at that host. If you go to Policies, Actions, and Alerts, there is a Impact Flag Alerts tab, and in here you can set up different types of alerts for each type of impact flag. So maybe I want to get an email notification if there are any vulnerable impact flags assigned by the FMC. I have heard about regular expressions popping up on the exam a lot. Why do you need to know about regular expressions for the CyberOps exam? Well, that's because they are used in programming languages, IPS signatures, and data search tools. Regular expressions are a sequence of characters that define a search pattern. Think of them as just a really easy way to summarize information. So if you wanted to match all of the public IP addresses on the internet in an IPS rule, instead of listing each of them, you could use a regular expression to only match the desired IP addresses with a few lines instead of thousands. This would keep the rule short and well organized. Let's take a look at how they can be used for IPS signature rules. Let's say I wanted to block any traffic that had the word hello in the payload. That may sound easy enough, but there are many ways to enter the word hello. How would I know which characters were lowercase or uppercase to match every variance of the word? Well, if I used a regular expression, like the one seen here, with one line I can match the word hello presented in any case. Here's another good example for if we wanted to match a HTTP URI containing bad word in any form. So now that you have a basic understanding of what the point of regular expressions are, let's hop into my Linux lab and we'll use regular expressions to search within the Linux system. So on my Linux machine, on the desktop, I have this file called malware, and if I open it up, I have some text that says malicious file and 12345. And I just threw in some text just so that we had something within the file to search for with our regular expressions. So I'll pull up my terminal, and how you can search for characters within Linux is with the grep command. The grep command stands for Global Regular Expression Print. So I'll say look for anything with the word file, all lowercase, and you have to put brackets around your regular expressions when you're defining them, in the file located on my desktop named malware. So this is going to search this file for the word file. Okay, so as you can see, it did not find the word file in all lowercase. And I showed you that the words malicious file were in the malware file on my desktop. So what are we missing here? Well, like the example I showed you with the word hello and matching lowercase or uppercase, if you remember, the word file had a uppercase F. So let me just put uppercase F and see if we find it this time. So there you go. It was able to search through that file and displayed the line with the word file in it. So if I didn't remember if it was lowercase or uppercase, I could use square brackets and put both lowercase and uppercase. And then when it searched for the word file, it would check for both file starting with lowercase f and uppercase F. So let's run this and see if it finds it this time. And there you go. Okay, so next let's search for the numbers within the malware file. So let's say, what if I do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? And then what if I said 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6? You can see that it did not match it because when you're just defining the actual text, it has to be exact. But if I were to use square brackets and say 1 through 6, then it's going to look and show me any line that has any number 1 through 6. So if I did like 6 through 9, as you can see, it did not show any results because I did not match the line. Next, I just want to show you a few other common regular expression commands. The caret command is used to match the beginning of a string. So I could say, look through this file and find anything that starts with mail. So it searched that file, and since this line started with MAL, it displayed it. Now let's try, we'll just do ALI. And you can see it did not work because this is only for the very beginning of the line. Another handy regular expression is the $sign, which matches the end of a line. So I could say anything in this file that ends with the number 5 match as a regular expression. As you can see, it matched the string of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now if I did 4, it's not going to work because it's starting from the right at the end and working its way in. So if I were to put 4, 5, then that would be an acceptable match with the $ regular expression to match the end of any string. Okay, now you should have a basic understanding of how you can use regular expressions. I've included some links as resources with this lecture that you can use to review to help you prepare for the exam.